Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. My name is Henry Crawford, and this happened to me back in 2010 at Devil's Lake State Park in Wisconsin. I'm a former middle school math teacher, and I'd saved up for years to buy a beaten-up RV so I could finally tour the country at my own pace. I'm not some mountain man or wilderness expert, just a guy who gets a kick out of waking up to a fresh view each morning. Early that spring, I packed a small cooler of soda, tossed a few of my mother's knitted blankets in the back, and decided I'd see how far my old rig would carry me before I had to head home. Devil's Lake was my first stop. I remember rolling in that late afternoon. The sky was pale and the wind had a little bite to it. My knees were stiff from driving. I found a decent campsite near the water, though the place was quieter than I expected. There were maybe 3 other RVs spread out across the grounds, each a good 100 yards apart. I could see 2 older women to my left chatting near their campfire, and a father with his teenage son across the loop, fiddling with a fishing rod. I liked the hush of the scene. It felt like a warm welcome after hours on the road. After I parked, I stepped out and stretched. The first thing I noticed was the lake's surface reflecting a scattering of clouds. A flock of geese skimmed the far shore. I set up my little folding chair, feeling a surge of excitement. Finally, I was here. No screaming kids in a classroom, no chalk dust in my hair, just me and nature's quiet. As I pulled out some jerky for dinner, I spotted a figure about 50 yards away, drifting between tree trunks. At first, I thought it might be a fellow camper searching for firewood. The sunlight was fading, and I only caught glimpses of a tall man wearing a dark jacket moving with a slight limp. He kept glancing my way, and there was something in his posture that made me uneasy. Maybe it was nothing, but the hair on my arms prickled, and I felt silly for tensing up over a stranger who hadn't even spoken to me. I tried to shake it off. I found myself whistling an old show tune as if I could drown out the odd vibe. I opened a soda, toasted the evening sky, and reminded myself I'd come here to relax. The other campers eventually ducked into their own vehicles or tents. Darkness thickened around the campground. My little lantern cast a warm circle of light that felt both cozy and isolating. Before crawling into bed, I strolled to the public restrooms. The wind carried a quiet rustling from the underbrush. I could make out the silhouettes of oak trees, a few boulders leaning toward the road. My footsteps sounded too loud. About halfway there, I noticed something near the tree line. A flash of movement again. That same tall figure. He stepped away from the trunk he'd been leaning against. This time, I heard him call out, but the wind whipped his words away. I froze. He took a step forward, and I managed a quick evening before continuing on. He offered no greeting back, only stared. I've never been a tough guy, but I tried to keep a cool head. Maybe he was just shy or had trouble speaking. Still, I hurried into the restroom. I felt a strange relief the moment I locked the stall. Then I laughed at myself for feeling safer in a tiny tiled box. A minute later, I headed back to the RV. I tried to look casual, but my steps were fast. By the time I slipped inside and locked the door, my pulse hammered. I didn't see him again that night. I fell asleep, telling myself I'd probably overreacted. Next morning, I discovered the father and son had left early. The older women were nowhere to be seen either. Maybe their trips were quick, but it felt odd. I brewed some coffee on my tiny stove and ate a stale muffin, planning to hike one of the lake trails. The park's main footpath was fairly empty. I passed a man in a baseball cap who nodded politely, then kept walking in the opposite direction. The trail wound along the lake shore, rising through patches of pine. Something smelled sweet, like blooming flowers, but there was also a faint metallic tang in the air. I tried ignoring it until I saw a shape slumped by a large boulder. It was the man in the baseball cap. At first I thought he was just resting, but then I saw the blood. His cap had fallen off, revealing a gash on the side of his head. I stumbled forward, heart pounding, and realized he wasn't breathing. A raw panic surged through me. I looked around, frantic. Nobody else was there. I stepped closer, hands shaking. That's when I saw the footprints in the mud leading away, fresh and deep. I wanted to call for help, but the signal on my phone was spotty. My mind spun. I thought about running back to the campground to find a ranger station, but as I turned, I heard a rustle in the brush. There he was, the tall man with a limp, watching me from behind a tree. Up close, I saw greasy hair plastered to his forehead, a jacket torn at the shoulder, and a smudge of dirt or blood across his jawline. I took a step back, and he advanced. My voice cracked when I yelled, "We need help. This man's hurt." He didn't answer. I noticed he held something metallic in his hand. It glinted in a stray beam of sunlight. Adrenaline took over. I bolted past the boulder, nearly tripped over a root, and sprinted downhill. I heard his footsteps behind me, heavy and uneven, but definitely in pursuit. My lungs burned. I slid down an embankment that cut a sharp path to the lake's edge. Without thinking, I made a dash along the water, kicking up gravel. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but any direction felt better than facing that man alone. Halfway back to the campground, I nearly collapsed behind a fallen log. My breath was ragged and sweat dripped into my eyes. That's when I spotted fresh drag marks in the dirt, leading to a patch of thick undergrowth. A second later, I saw a boot sticking out from behind the shrubs. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I approached and found another body, one of the older women I had seen the day before. Her hiking jacket was streaked with mud. Her face was pale. No question, she was gone. I swallowed back a wave of nausea. This was real, and I was in the middle of it. I needed the ranger station or the park office. There should be a map near the parking area, not too far from the campsite. I forced myself to keep moving. Each snapped twig made me flinch. I was sure he could hear me. My legs felt like rubber, but I refused to stop. When I finally saw the line of RVs and parked cars, I almost cried with relief. I heard an engine rumble nearby, then spotted an official-looking truck. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting. A park ranger climbed out, eyes wide. He asked what happened. I tried to explain in broken sentences, but before we could even process it, the tall man emerged from the trees. He moved quickly, ignoring the ranger's order to stop. There was a blur of action I barely understood. The ranger reached for his radio, trying to call for backup, but the man lunged at him with that metallic object, a large hunting knife. I shouted for help, fumbled for a rock, anything to defend myself. The ranger managed to dodge, but he stumbled on uneven ground, falling onto his back. The knife slashed the air. I threw the rock, catching the attacker in the ribs. It must have stunned him just enough for the ranger to pull out his sidearm. He fired, catching the attacker in the shoulder. The tall man staggered, dropping the blade. Blood seeped through his jacket. He glared at us, rage twisting his features. For a moment, he tried to move forward, but his knees buckled. The ranger stayed on guard, weapon trained on him. Another shot rang out when the man reached for the knife again. He collapsed, face pressed into the dirt, his breath going silent. The next hours felt like a fever dream. Police arrived with an ambulance. They checked me over, asked 1,000 questions. They cordoned off the area around the bodies. I watched them carry the tall man away under a blood-stained sheet. He was gone. Campers emerged from their vehicles, drawn by the chaos, stepping carefully around the taped-off scenes. My RV never looked so comforting as it did then, though I knew the memory of what happened would forever taint that place. I stayed long enough to give a statement. By evening, I found myself standing in line at a nearby motel, desperate for a normal shower and a locked door. I don't know why or how this man chose those victims, or what final snap in his mind led him down that path. Maybe he'd been lurking around for days, hidden in the foliage, waiting for opportunities. The police had their theories, but none of them brought back the people who died. It's been 3 years, and I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in Devil's Lake again. I still have the RV. It's been parked in my driveway for a while now, growing dusty. Sometimes I think about selling it and forgetting that trip ever happened. Maybe one day I'll do that. Or maybe I'll drive out again somewhere a lot busier with brighter lights. For now, I'm just taking it day by day. I'm still shaken, but I'm breathing. And I guess that counts for something. My name is Jonathan Redgrave, and this all went down in 2009 when I drove my battered RV through Kennebunkport, Maine, looking for some peace and quiet on my summer break from teaching 6th grade math in a small town school. I had saved for that RV for 2 years, and though it rattled like a loose shopping cart, I was proud of it. I'd glued old postcards above the kitchenette, pasted small seashells on the windowsills, and taped a photo of my dog, Rusty, rest his lazy soul on the dashboard. The engine made a noise like it wanted to quit every time I pressed the gas, but I was too determined to care. When I rolled into Kennebunkport, I found a small, family-owned campground at the edge of a coastal inlet. The place looked cozy enough: a few fire pits, a small general store with a squeaky screen door, and the Atlantic breeze drifting in. I parked beside a scruffy pine tree and stepped out to stretch my legs. A couple in a newer camper waved hello. The wife introduced herself as Linda, and the husband was Dave. They seemed friendly, but I was more interested in getting my folding chair out and enjoying the sea air. As I settled in, I noticed a battered pickup truck creeping through the campground. The driver's window was down. A lean man with graying hair stared at each of us campers and turned before stepping on the gas. He didn't look like a staff member. No wave, no nod, just a hard look. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe he was a local who didn't love out-of-towners. I remember thinking that was the extent of it. I couldn't have been more wrong. That evening, I made small talk with Linda and Dave around a crackling fire. Dave was a truck driver who liked to fish. Linda was a retired nurse. We shared some hearty laughs about the joys of cheap lodging and the hazards of public restrooms. I felt at ease. Before heading back to my RV, I caught sight of the same battered truck from earlier parked at the far edge of the lot. The man in the driver's seat was staring into the flames like he was measuring us. It made me a little uneasy, but I told myself it wasn't my problem. People are strange sometimes. Early the next morning, I woke to the patter of light rain and decided to walk down to the shore. The tide was out and the rocks were slick with algae. I spotted a cluster of old traps stacked near a weathered boathouse. The air smelled like salt and seaweed. I leaned over to snap a few pictures with my old digital camera. That's when I heard quiet footsteps behind me. "Morning," a voice said. I spun around to see that same lean man with graying hair. Now he wore a thick flannel shirt and a crusted bandage stuck out from his left sleeve. Morning," I said, trying not to sound startled. He scanned me up and down. "You here alone?" I was tempted to lie, but I said, "I've got some friends back at the campground." He nodded slowly. "Just watch out for the rocks. People slip and crack their heads open." Then he turned and walked away, boots splashing in the shallow tide. I noticed an odd limp in his step. I felt odd about the conversation. More than odd, I felt a sting of caution. But again, I tried to tell myself he was just a gruff local. I spent the day reading in my RV, playing solitaire on a rickety table, and occasionally chatting with Linda and Dave. That night, the clouds cleared. A breeze carried the scent of pine and saltwater right through the open windows. At around 10, I heard a commotion outside. I jumped down from my RV, adrenaline pumping, and saw flashlights swinging in the darkness. Linda was yelling Dave's name near the tree line. I ran to her side. She was trembling, eyes darting everywhere. "Dave went to gather extra wood," she said, "but he's gone." I remember the battered pickup truck. I remember the man's dead-eyed stare. My mind leapt to the worst. Together, we followed the trail of footprints into a small patch of pine trees, searching with Linda's flashlight. After about 100 yards, we found Dave's baseball cap stained with something dark. I swallowed hard. We pressed on, calling his name, scanning every bush and trunk. Then Linda pointed the beam toward a clearing. I wished I'd never seen what was there. Dave was lying face down. I rushed over, knelt, and gently turned him. His eyes stared blankly. He wasn't breathing. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. Linda let out a cracked gasp. Then she crumpled onto her knees. I didn't see any bullet holes, but I saw blood on his shirt. There was no sign of the attacker, but I felt watched, like there was someone close by, hidden behind those dark pines. I told Linda we had to call the police. We scrambled back to the campground, hearts hammering like drums. She dialed 911 on her phone while I alerted the campground manager. The manager, Harold, was in his 70s and could barely stand straight from arthritis, but he grabbed a shotgun from behind the counter. "Nobody messes with my place," he muttered. He offered to go look for the killer, but I insisted we wait for the police. We huddled in Harold's cramped office until the authorities arrived. I tried to distract Linda by asking about her nursing career, but it was no use. She just kept repeating Dave's name. I rubbed my temples, trying to think how this could have happened. That battered pickup truck, the lean man with the limp, he was the only suspect in my head. I told the arriving officers everything I knew. They combed the area, found the footprints, and took Linda's statement. I expected them to tell us to leave it to them. Instead, an officer said quietly, "We've had a few incidents around here. Folks gone missing. This might be connected." Despite the danger, I couldn't bear to leave Linda alone in that half-empty campground. I parked my RV closer to her camper, so we were about 10 feet apart. An officer stayed on watch, patrolling the perimeter with a flashlight. The night felt endless. I couldn't sleep. My mind spun over Dave's sudden, brutal end. Around 3 in the morning, I stepped outside for some air. I saw the policeman patrolling near the office. Then I noticed a figure lurking behind the bathhouse, hunched and still. It looked like that same man, tall, gaunt, graying hair. My heart pounded, and I crept back to Linda's camper. I knocked gently. She opened the door, eyes puffy from crying. "He's here," I whispered. She nodded, fear cutting her voice. We locked ourselves inside her camper, turning off the lights. Minutes stretched. I heard the officer's footsteps, then silence. Then I heard a metallic clang from outside, like a tool dropping on concrete. Next thing, a loud crash came from the policeman's direction. Linda gripped my arm. I cracked open the door to see what was happening. The flashlight lay on the ground, pointing at a jumble of crates. The policeman was nowhere in sight. My mouth went dry. I had no clue where the killer was. We stayed put, breath hitching. Eventually, we made a dash to my RV, thinking it might be better to drive away. But the second we stepped into the open, the lean man appeared from behind a cluster of picnic tables. He lunged at me with a hunting knife. Linda screamed. I stumbled backward, flailing my arms, managing to knock him off balance. His knife slashed at the air between us. He hissed under his breath, eyes flashing with some wild anger. There was no question in my mind. He intended to do to me what he'd done to Dave. Linda sprinted toward the office while I wrestled the man's wrist. He was strong despite his wiry frame. The blade grazed my forearm, stinging hot. I twisted my body, trying to pull him around. We stumbled on the gravel, kicking up dust. He drove a knee into my stomach. I doubled over, wheezing. My mind roared with panic, but I heard Linda yelling for help. The man tried to stab me again, but I rolled out of reach. I reached for a loose rock near my feet, swung it toward his head, and caught him across the ear. He staggered, kneeling, blinking in confusion. By then, Harold arrived with that shotgun, shouting, "Freeze!" His hands were shaking, but he leveled the weapon at the attacker. Lights flooded the campground as backup police cruisers rolled in. Officers rushed in, disarming the man and slamming him to the ground. I lay there, chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. Someone help me up. Another officer found their colleague unconscious near the crates with a gash on his shoulder, but still breathing. They hauled the attacker into a squad car. I never learned his name, only that he'd lived in an abandoned shack by the water. The police told us he might have been involved in other crimes around the region. Linda was too numb to say much. She left Kennebunkport the next day after giving her statement. The campground felt desolate after that. I spent one more night in my RV, eyes peeled for any sound or movement. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I thanked Harold, packed my things, and quietly drove away. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I imagined that lean figure glaring after me, but I knew they had him in custody. That didn't stop my pulse from racing. I hear Linda went home to be with her family. The last I heard, she was doing her best to cope with her loss. As for me, I kept teaching math, but I never took that kind of trip alone again. Maybe I'm a little skittish now. Maybe I hold on to this memory more than I should, but I'm still here and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I don't know if I'll ever forget Dave's cap lying in the mud, or the way his wife's voice cracked when she found him. Some things stay with you no matter how far you drive. You can cross every state line in the country, but you can't outrun certain memories. Sometimes the safest seeming places can hold the deepest horrors. All I know is I got out alive, and that's enough for me. I never wanted to take the job, not this one. But when the bills pile up and your savings start running dry, you do what you have to, even if it means going back to the place you swore you'd never see again, Dead Man's Pass. It was Eddie's death that did it. 15 years ago, I lost my brother on that road. His rig skidded off a curve and plunged into the canyon. I was driving a mile behind him when it happened, saw the whole thing through my windshield like a damn nightmare unfolding in slow motion. I've never been the same since. I never could forgive myself for not doing more, not being there to help. That's how it goes in this life. You haul, you drive, you move forward, keep the past in the rear view. But it's never that simple, is it? I'm Hank Collins, but most people on the road know me as Rusty. Maybe it's the hair going gray, or maybe it's just the wear and tear of 30 years behind the wheel. I've spent most of my life running rigs, hauling everything from livestock to construction equipment. This time I was hauling heavy machinery for a mining outfit in Utah. Easy enough, or so I thought. The cargo didn't bother me. What bothered me was the route. Route 163, through the heart of Monument Valley, and then up through Dead Man's Pass, the very stretch of road where Eddie lost his life. I've avoided it for years, but I couldn't avoid it this time. The money was too good, and the job came at a time when I needed it most. The first sign that something wasn't right came when I crossed into the desert. The vast expanse of red rocks stretched out for miles, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. It should have been peaceful, almost beautiful, but there was something off. The radio cut out first, static, then silence. Not unusual out here, but it didn't sit right. The stillness felt heavy, oppressive, like the desert itself was holding its breath. As the sun slipped away completely, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably another trucker making the same route. But as the miles passed, those headlights didn't get closer. They stayed there, far back but steady, like whoever it was didn't intend to pass or fall behind, just keeping pace. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. The canyon walls began to rise on either side of me, the road narrowing as I approached Dead Man's Pass. My hands tightened on the wheel, the familiar knot of tension growing in my chest. The road was winding, dangerous, with steep cliffs on one side and jagged rock on the other. I'd driven it 100 times before, but not since the night Eddie died. As I climbed higher, the truck started to act up. First, it was the brakes. They began to make a grinding noise that sent vibrations up through the cab. They were new, serviced just a week ago, no reason they should be failing. Then the engine sputtered just once, but enough to make my heart jump. "Come on, Rusty," I muttered to myself. "Just keep moving, 1 mile at a time." But the truck didn't listen. The headlights behind me were still there, never getting any closer, never fading away. Something about it gnawed at me, a slow realization creeping in. I knew that truck. It was Eddie's. It couldn't be. Of course, Eddie's truck was a wreck at the bottom of the canyon, rusted and forgotten. But the make, the model, even the busted left headlight, it was all the same. And it was following me. I turned up the CB, hoping for some noise to drown out my thoughts, but all I got was static. My hands were sweating now, the wheels slick beneath my fingers. The canyon walls seemed to press in tighter as I reached the most dangerous curve, the very spot where Eddie went over the edge. My foot eased off the gas, but then the CB crackled to life and a voice broke through the static. "Rusty, Hank, you gotta stop." I nearly jerked the wheel in shock. I knew that voice. It was impossible, but I knew it. It was Eddie. "Eddie," I whispered, even though I knew there was no way it could be real. I fumbled with the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the voice only grew louder, swallowed by the hiss of static. "Rusty, you gotta stop. You can't make the same mistake." I was losing my mind. That's what this was. Too many years on the road, too many ghosts haunting me. That's all it was. But then the truck sputtered again. The grinding in the brakes got worse. I could feel the whole rig shudder as I tried to slow down, but the brakes weren't responding. I pumped them hard, but nothing. The curve was coming up fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it if the brakes didn't hold. "Damn it!" I shouted, yanking the wheel hard to the right, pulling off onto the narrow shoulder. The truck screeched to a stop, just inches from the cliff's edge. For a long time, I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the drop below. The canyon stretched out beneath me, a black abyss swallowing the last traces of daylight. My breathing was ragged, my hands shaking, and then I saw it. Eddie's truck was still there, sitting on the road behind me, headlights glowing dimly through the dust. But now I could see it wasn't just a truck. The rig was mangled, twisted, just like it had been after the accident. The front end was smashed in, the cab crumpled, the windshield shattered, and standing next to it was Eddie. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but he didn't disappear. He was there, as clear as day. His face was pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, but it was him. He was looking right at me. I stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know what I expected to happen, but I had to get closer. I had to see Eddie. My voice cracked as I took a step toward him. How are you?" He didn't speak, just stared at me with those hollow eyes. Then slowly he raised a hand, pointing down the canyon. I followed his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. The wreckage of his truck lying at the bottom of the canyon, just as it had been all those years ago. "No," I whispered. This can't be real." Eddie's voice echoed in my mind, though his lips didn't move. "You gotta stop, Rusty. You gotta stop running." I fell to my knees, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I had run from this for so long, buried it deep, but now there was no escaping it. Eddie wasn't here for revenge. He wasn't here to haunt me. He was here because I'd never let him go. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears burning my eyes. "I'm sorry, Eddie. It was my fault. I should have listened. I should have stopped." The wind howled through the canyon, and for a moment, it sounded like Eddie was speaking again, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was forgiveness. "I never blamed you, Rusty," his voice whispered softer now, like it was being carried away by the wind. "But you gotta forgive yourself." The headlights of Eddie's truck flickered once, then went out. The figure standing beside it began to fade, dissolving into the dust and shadows of the canyon. And then he was gone. I sat there on the edge of the road, staring down into the canyon where my brother's truck had fallen. The air was still, the only sound, the soft hum of the desert wind. I didn't know how long I sat there, but when I finally got to my feet, something had shifted inside me. The guilt was still there, but it wasn't crushing me anymore. It wasn't tearing me apart from the inside. I could breathe again. I climbed back into the cab and started the engine. The truck roared to life, and the brakes responded this time, smooth and steady, as I pulled back onto the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. There was nothing there. No truck, no headlights, just empty miles of desert behind me. I smiled a sad, tired smile. It was time to stop running, time to go home. As I drove through Dead Man's Pass, the echoes of the past faded into the night, leaving only the road ahead. My name is Nathaniel Vexley, and this happened back in 2011 on Mackinac Island in Michigan, while I was driving through the Midwest in my old RV. I used to work as a part-time librarian in Boston, but I've got a restless spirit. After saving enough money, I decided to take a year off and tour wherever my wheels could manage. My rig was a clunky, cream-colored monster from the late 80s that always smelled like stale coffee. Still, I loved the freedom it gave me. One morning in August, I hopped on the ferry to Mackinac with my RV and a few days' worth of groceries, determined to enjoy the island's slower pace before heading west. I had never been to Mackinac before, but people told me it was scenic with no cars allowed aside from emergency vehicles. The quaint architecture and horse-drawn carriages drew me in right away. After disembarking, I found a small lot that permitted overnight RV parking. It wasn't exactly scenic, just a narrow patch of gravel near some trees, but it felt cozy enough. I set up a couple of folding chairs outside, brewed myself a fresh cup of coffee on the portable stove, and settled in to watch the occasional bike rider pass by. A middle-aged couple, Susan and Jim, parked their RV next to mine the following day. They were friendly folks from Cleveland on their own adventure. We swapped travel stories and found out we all loved roadside diners and cheesy souvenirs. Susan gave me a small decorative spoon she had picked up on a previous trip, joking that I should start a collection. I laughed, promising I'd use it for stirring sugar in my morning brew. It was that afternoon that I first noticed an odd figure. He stood at the far edge of the parking lot, leaning against a tall oak tree. So he wore a battered baseball cap pulled low over his brow and a heavy denim jacket, even though it was scorching out. His jeans were tattered, and he had this rigid stance like someone who'd been standing still for hours. I thought maybe he was just waiting for someone or trying to cool off in the shade. So I shrugged it off. He never approached us, and he disappeared into the woods when evening came. Susan teased me, saying I should write a detective novel about mysterious denim jacket men in quiet places. I laughed it off, but something about his eyes, how I felt like he was calculating every move from a distance, made me uneasy. Normally I'm not jumpy, but that night I locked the RV door and double-checked my windows before going to bed. The next morning I walked over to the local bakery for some donuts. The place smelled of fresh dough and sugar. While I was selecting a glazed twist, I overheard a woman whispering to the cashier about a local rumor, something about a drifter who'd shown up and started doing odd jobs, but who had a short fuse. I glanced their way, feeling my pulse quicken, but they hushed up when they noticed me. I paid for my donuts and hustled back to my RV. When I returned to the parking lot, I saw Jim out front pacing. He looked pale and anxious. He said Susan had gone for a quick bike ride and hadn't come back, which was unusual since she'd only planned to circle the block. He asked if I'd help him look. We split up. He'd check the shops near Main Street, and I'd walk down the quiet paths by the shore. As I walked, I kept noticing that same figure in the denim jacket, always at the corner of my eye, always far enough away that if I shouted, he'd vanish before anyone else saw him. I told myself not to panic. Mackinac is a friendly island. Still, I wished I had a better plan than just wandering around. I decided to head deeper into the wooded area beyond the parking lot. Even though it wasn't part of the usual tourist spots, I saw broken branches and disturbed foliage like someone had pushed through recently. My gut twisted, but I kept going, telling myself Susan might have taken a wrong turn. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the ground was soft with layers of leaves. I heard distant birds, the clop of hooves on the main road, and then nothing else, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. About 100 yards in, I spotted Susan's bike. It was on its side, wheels bent like it had been stomped on. My stomach churned. She wasn't anywhere near it, but I found a trail of footprints leading farther in. I followed, stepping as quietly as I could. My heart thudded against my ribcage, but I forced myself forward. That's when I saw him. The man in denim stood near a cluster of towering pine trees, and he was dragging something. My mind froze until I realized it was Susan's body. She wasn't moving, and there was blood along her back and arms. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from yelling. The man dropped her near a fallen log, crouching with one knee down as if he was checking for signs of life. My palms were sweaty, and I inched behind a thick trunk. I hoped he hadn't noticed me. Then, without warning, he pulled out a hunting knife from inside his jacket. My head pounded. I saw him place the blade to Susan's throat. Her eyes fluttered open just barely, like she was on the brink of consciousness. The man pressed down and she went still. My mind screamed at me to do something, but fear pinned me. This was no mugging. He was calm, like this was routine. After a few seconds, he stood up, wiped the blade on his pant leg and grabbed Susan's ankles as if to move her deeper into the woods. I must have gasped. He stopped and glanced around, scanning the trees. I ducked low, but it was too late. He spun and sprinted toward me, mouth set in a tight line. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks, branches scratching my face. My heart hammered with each stride. I heard him crashing through the undergrowth behind me, gaining ground with every step. "Hey!" Jim's voice echoed from somewhere ahead. I burst into a small clearing and nearly collided with him. Before I could speak, the man lunged from the trees, brandishing that blood-stained knife. Jim tried to tackle him, but he was knocked to the dirt. The blade came down, slicing Jim's shoulder. He screamed in pain, clutching the wound as dark red stained his shirt. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was anger, or maybe it was pure adrenaline. But I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it at the man's torso. He grunted and staggered back, giving me enough time to help Jim up. We scrambled away, half running, half limping, heading for the path we'd come from. I yelled for help over and over, my voice cracking. We burst out of the woods onto a small lane by the edge of the parking lot. A couple of cyclists stopped, alarmed at the sight of Jim's bleeding shoulder. I yelled for someone to call the police. The man in denim appeared at the tree line, knife in hand, chest heaving. For a moment, I thought he might charge at all of us, but the sight of new witnesses seemed to rattle him. He took a step back, spun around, and vanished among the trees. We got Jim to the nearest medical station on the island. The local police arrived soon after. They took our statements, then organized a search party to comb the woods. I told them about Susan. The officer who found her said she'd been killed. Jim was devastated. He kept muttering that he should have gone with her on the bike ride that morning. I had no words to comfort him. They never found the man that day, but they discovered signs of someone living rough on the fringes of the island. An abandoned camp, scraps of food, a tarp. Locals speculated he might have hopped on a night ferry or stolen a small boat to reach the mainland. I spent the next few hours filing reports, describing his face, his jacket, the horrifying moment in the trees. Then the officers told me I should consider moving on. They'd stay on alert, but Mackinac Island was still a small place, and folks were spooked. That evening, I packed up my RV and said a quiet goodbye to Jim. He looked hollow, clutching Susan's spoon with trembling hands. I gave him a shaky hug, unsure if I'd ever see him again. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt endless. So my shoulders ached with tension, and every little noise made me jump. I drove until I couldn't keep my eyes open, then pulled into a well-lit rest stop. My own reflection in the rearview mirror startled me. I looked older, like I'd aged a decade in one day. I locked all the doors, closed the curtains, and tried to sleep. Though every small bump in the night jolted me awake, there's not much more to say. I still remember Susan's warm smile when she handed me that silly little spoon. I think about Jim's haunted eyes as he watched me leave. I wonder if he managed to find any peace, or if the island ever located the man responsible for everything. Even now, the thought of returning there fills me with dread. I keep Susan's spoon in the RV's glove compartment, a reminder of how fast things can change. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, wishing there was a way to rewrite that day. But there isn't, and I've made my peace with that fact. It's all part of the road I chose, and that's all I've got left now. Just a broken memory and a spoon that stirs my coffee on lonely mornings. My name is Gabriel Duskwood, and this happened back in 2012 at Lake Tacoma, right where Oklahoma meets the Texas border. While I was taking my beloved old RV out for a much-needed break from everything, I had just turned 30, and I figured I deserved a bit of downtime after spending a decade fixing air conditioning units and scorching summers. My boss used to say I had the sunniest disposition he'd seen. But to be honest, I just like telling goofy jokes to keep folks smiling. That's probably why people don't expect me to travel alone. They assume I'm too social to roam the highways by myself. Well, I appreciate company, but I also enjoy my own thoughts. And that week I decided to vanish into the wild for a spell. Lake Tux always called to me because it's got shimmering water and plenty of open space to park the RV near fishing spots. I love the sound of waves against the hull of a boat and the laughter of families pulling up catfish. It reminds me of summer trips with my folks. Even though my dad passed away years ago, the place still carries the warmth of my childhood. I parked near a quiet inlet on a Friday afternoon. A few folks were around, some families with kids running about, a middle-aged couple grilling burgers, and one or two folks like me who just wanted a quiet corner of the lake. I spent the first evening sipping a cheap soda, leaning against my RV and trying to spot shooting stars. The sky was clear and the weather felt perfect. Mild breeze, no humidity biting at my neck. I thought about a conversation I'd had once with my old buddy Darnell, where he claimed he could see UFOs if he stared long enough. I chuckled at the memory, shook my head, and went inside my RV to doze off. The next morning, I woke early to fish from the pier. I was halfway through tying my lure when I heard a gentle murmur from behind me. This was Tucker, a fellow traveler who had parked his RV a bit upriver. He was wiry, with a small tattoo of a hawk on his left forearm. He said he'd been on the road for a year after losing his job. We exchanged a few jokes, teased each other about who'd catch more fish, and settled into companionable silence. The first cast, my line got tangled. He roared with laughter, and I decided I liked him right then and there. Not long after, we noticed a man waiting along the shoreline, a good distance away. He wore tattered jeans and a black jacket, even though the sun was starting to heat things up. He had a gaunt face with deep-set eyes, and he kept scanning the water, then scanning our direction like he was looking for something. Tucker and I gave each other a quizzical glance, but we didn't say much. Lake Tux was full of odd characters now and then, people drifting through, chasing catfish or chasing a bit of peace. Around noon, Tucker and I parted ways. I headed back to my RV to fix some lunch. I just pulled out a cold sandwich when I heard a commotion near the couple grilling burgers. A scream, high and panicked, echoed across the campground. I ran over, and Tucker arrived from another direction at the same time. That same gaunt-faced man was standing about 10 yards away from the grill, staring like he'd seen a ghost. The husband, a hefty, friendly-looking guy in a Best Dad Ever t-shirt, was on the ground. At first, I couldn't tell what was wrong. Then I realized there was blood pooling under him. It made no sense. 1 second, they were probably flipping burgers. The next, he was clutching his ribs with wide, terrified eyes. The stranger in the black jacket bolted. I remember the wife screaming, "He stabbed him!" Tucker and I rushed over, but the man on the ground was hurt bad. He was coughing, eyes rolling back. I felt my stomach churn, but I held it together and pressed my hands on his wound to slow the bleeding. The wife was too shocked to do much besides call 911. Tucker sprinted off after the attacker, but he didn't come back for a while. I stayed there, pressing on that wound, my arms shaking, doing my best to keep the man alive. He mumbled something about "tell my kids," but I couldn't make sense of the rest. I tried to calm him, tried to keep him focused, but soon he stopped blinking. My ears started ringing. People talk about time slowing down in these moments, and they're right. It felt like minutes stretched into hours. All I could do was stare at my blood-stained hands. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late for that poor guy. The campground erupted in panic. Most folks started packing up immediately. Nobody wanted to linger with a killer on the loose. I stumbled back to my RV in a daze, noticing cops streaming into the area, sirens wailing. An officer took my statement, and that's when I realized Tucker was still missing. After a while, the sun dipped low and the camp took on a frantic energy. Hardly anyone was left except for a few squad cars and a couple of determined fishermen who refused to cut their trip short. I decided to stay put, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of fear for Tucker's safety. As darkness fell, a pair of officers told me they hadn't caught the suspect. They suggested I lock my doors and stay vigilant. I tried to eat dinner, but ended up losing my appetite. My mind kept replaying the scene. That gaunt face, the stunned look on my husband's face, blood on my hands. I paced inside the RV for what felt like hours. Midnight came and went. I flicked on every exterior light I had, scanning the shadows from my window, feeling my heartbeat thud in my ears. The only comforting thought was that the police were circling the area. Sometime past midnight, I heard a knock on my RV door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hands fumbled around for something, anything to protect myself. I grabbed a tire iron and opened the door a crack. There stood Tucker, panting hard, sweat dripping off him, face pale as a sheet. He stumbled in without waiting for an invitation. He confessed he'd followed that killer partway down a trail near the water, but lost him in the thick undergrowth. Then, while searching, Tucker said he found something horrific behind a cluster of rocks. He discovered two people, probably hikers, dead. They looked like they'd been attacked the same way. Tucker was shaking as he described it. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. We realized we were dealing with a man more deranged than we'd initially thought. This wasn't a single random act. We called the police again to let them know about the new victims. The dispatcher said they'd send a team to search, but it might take time to reach that rocky area in the dark. Tucker and I just sat there in my cramped RV, listening to every rustle of wind, trying not to jump at every creek. I tried to lighten the mood by joking about how we'd probably never want to go fishing again after this, but neither of us could laugh. At some point, exhaustion took over. Tucker dozed off in the passenger seat, clutching a flashlight like it was a precious gem. I nearly fell asleep too. But a noise outside jolted me awake. A scrape along the RV's exterior. My heart hammered. I reached for the tire iron again, motioned for Tucker to get down, and peeked through the curtains. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then a silhouette drifted across my headlight beam. That black jacket, those hollow eyes. He was right outside. I whispered to Tucker, "He's here," and my voice wavered in a way I'd never heard before. We heard the man try the RV door, rattling it. Adrenaline shot through my veins. I shouted, "Go away! The cops are coming!" My mind raced, imagining what he might do next. Suddenly, glass shattered. He'd smashed the passenger window. Tucker yelped and scrambled back. The killer reached in, trying to unlock the door from the inside. I swung that tire iron hard, connecting with his arm. He let out a sharp hiss of pain, pulled back, and cursed. In that sliver of time, Tucker lunged forward and slammed the butt of the flashlight straight into the guy's jaw. The man staggered, but he didn't stop. He tried to drag Tucker halfway out the window. I grabbed Tucker's belt, yanked him back, and swung again. Amid the flailing arms, the killer dropped something, a small knife that clattered onto the RV floor. The tension in that second felt suffocating. The door gave way. He was halfway inside. I thought, we're dead if we don't fight. Tucker and I both started kicking and punching wildly. It was ugly, feral, and terrifying. We managed to knock him out of the door. He hit the ground with a thud, and I heard him groan in pain. For a moment, he lay there stunned. We were about to shut the door when he bolted to his feet and ran off into the darkness. I caught a glimpse of his expression in the RV's headlights. It was pure rage, like he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. My body shook, and I struggled to breathe. Tucker and I piled into the driver's seat, started the engine, and took off, trying to reach the nearest police checkpoint. We found an officer's car not far up the main road. We flagged him down, and soon enough, a flood of police cruisers swarmed the area. By dawn, they'd apprehended the suspect. The relief felt overwhelming. I finally let my tired body collapse into a camp chair near the station set up by the ranger's office. I glanced at my blood-stained shirt and shaky hands, realizing how close we'd come to being just another pair of corpses in the brush. That's all behind me now. But I still think about that poor husband and those two hikers, and I wonder if I could have done more. Tucker and I kept in touch for a while, swapping occasional messages about safer, friendlier spots. I haven't been back to Lake Tacoma since. One of these days, maybe I'll try to fish there again without panicking at every noise. Right now, though, I'm just grateful to be breathing. I drove my RV home a day later, tired, haunted, but alive. I wish I had a neat final thought. Sometimes the best I can do is remind myself that I'm okay, and that's enough. The forest was supposed to be my escape. I drove the RV deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains, hoping the solitude would offer some kind of peace. I had been out here a few times before, never this deep though, but it had always been calming. Nature had a way of quieting the noise in my head. After I left the job, the silence became my companion, even though it haunted me with memories I wasn't ready to face, the accident that had ended my career as a paramedic. Every night, it replayed in my mind, always the same horrific details. But with each viewing, I saw a new way I could have saved the child, a different decision a split second sooner, and maybe it didn't matter. I was here now, alone. The sound of the gravel crunched under my tires as I parked off an old dirt road. It was oddly satisfying. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, there was bliss. No noise except for the rustle of trees in the wind. This was what I needed. No sirens, no screaming, just the mountains. I grabbed my bag and climbed out, stretching my legs before heading over to the old fire lookout tower nearby. It was a relic, long abandoned and forgotten by most hikers. The wood was graying, peeling away from years of exposure, but it stood firm, a silent sentinel watching over the rolling hills. Something about the place had always intrigued me. It had a gravity to it, like it was holding secrets that only those who ventured close enough could learn. I planned to spend the weekend here, at least 3 days before I had to go back to reality. I didn't need much, just the stillness, the mountains, and a break from the memories. I set up camp near the RV, built a small fire, and tried to let go. But the quiet was different this time. The first night, it started with whispers. I was sitting by the fire, watching the flames flicker against the trees when I thought I heard voices. not nearby, but carried on the wind, faint, like a conversation just out of reach. I strained to listen, but they faded, lost in the rustle of the leaves. Probably just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I hadn't slept well in weeks, and the quiet, while peaceful, was unnerving in its own way. After a while, I retreated to the RV, exhausted, but the voices lingered in the back of my mind, soft murmurs that tugged at my thoughts. As I lay down, I told myself it was nothing, just echoes of people who had camped here long before. The wind could carry sounds in strange ways out here, but the deeper I fell into sleep, the louder they grew until I jerked awake, covered in sweat. There were no voices, just the oppressive weight of silence. I stared at the ceiling, the same question running through my mind. Was this peace or something else? The next morning, things started to get strange. I woke to find my watch blinking, frozen at 2:47 a.m. I tapped the screen a few times, but it refused to budge. Strange. When I checked my phone, it was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I chalked it up to bad luck, but when I stepped out of the RV, the sun seemed higher in the sky than it should have been. It was late morning, but it felt like I had only just fallen asleep. I spent the day hiking, keeping my mind occupied. The trail was familiar. I'd hiked this ridge before, but something about it felt different. Landmarks I swore I'd seen on the way up seemed out of place, or worse, missing. And every time I thought I was making progress, I'd find myself right back where I started. The same twisted tree, the same rock formation, a loop. The disorientation didn't set in all at once. It was a slow, creeping unease that settled in my bones. The wind felt wrong too, as if it was carrying something. I couldn't quite hear those whispers again, faint, distorted, carried on the breeze. This time, they were closer. By nightfall, the voices were louder. They weren't whispers anymore, but full conversations, disembodied words spoken in tones I couldn't place. It was like someone was just out of view, talking, laughing. At first, I stayed by the fire, trying to block it out, but the longer I sat there, the clearer the voices became. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as if they were replaying over and over, fragments of words lost on the wind. I stood up, scanning the tree line. Shadows flickered just beyond the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking in the stillness. No answer. The hairs on my neck stood up as I watched the shadows shift, a figure. It moved between the trees, far enough that I couldn't see clearly, but close enough to make my pulse quicken. My first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone lost. But when I took a step toward it, it vanished, gone as if it had never been there. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam of light revealed nothing but trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks again, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something here, something I didn't understand. I retreated to the RV, locking the door behind me. But even inside, the silence was heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The voices were still there, faint now but constant. It felt like someone was standing just outside the RV, talking in circles, over and over. The next morning, I hiked to the old fire lookout. I don't know why. Something about the tower drew me in, like I needed to be there. It was old, dilapidated, and crumbling, but it held a strange power. When I reached the top, I could see for miles. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched out in every direction, green and endless. I expected to feel some sense of peace, but instead, a deep dread settled in my chest. The lookout wasn't empty. It was filled with the remnants of people who had come here before me. Old camping gear, torn sleeping bags, cans of food long since expired, graffiti scratched into the wooden beams, names etched into the walls. And something else, carved into the center of the floor, was a symbol. A crude spiral looping in on itself. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. It looked old, weathered, like it had been there forever. The voices returned, this time louder, clearer. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the tower was empty, just the wind whistling through the cracks in the wood. I ran my hands through my hair, my heart pounding in my chest. Something was very wrong here. The ridge, the lookout. It wasn't just an old campsite. It was a trap, a loop, and I was stuck in it. I tried to leave that afternoon, packed up the RV, started the engine, and drove down the winding road that had brought me here. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape didn't change. the trees, the rocks, it all blurred together, the same stretches of road repeating over and over. After what felt like hours, I found myself back at the campsite, the fire now cold and dead, sitting in the exact same spot. My heart sank. I tried again. This time I took a different route. But once again, the RV looped back to the same spot. It was as if the mountain wouldn't let me leave. By nightfall, I knew the truth. The whispers weren't random. They weren't in my head. They were echoes. Echoes of the past, of people who had been here before me, people who had tried to leave and failed. I sat in the RV, staring out the window at the darkening woods. The figures had returned. This time, there were more of them. They moved between the trees, watching me, waiting. One by one, they stepped into the clearing surrounding the RV. I could see them now, faded, distorted, like shadows of people long gone. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate. They said nothing, but I could hear them. Their voices, the same words looping over and over. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. This was it. I was stuck, trapped in their endless loop, just like they were. The door creaked open. I don't remember what happened next, only that I woke up the next morning, sitting by the cold, dead fire. The RV door was wide open, the woods empty and still, but the whispers were gone. For now. I don't know how long I've been here. Days, weeks, time doesn't seem to work the same way anymore. Every time I think I'm getting closer to an answer, I find myself right back where I started. I'm not alone on this ridge. There are others. I can hear them sometimes, their voices echoing. My name is Dorian Cross, and this happened to me back in 2009 in Delana, Georgia, while I was out exploring in my battered old RV and thinking I finally had the time to stretch my legs after quitting my office job that never let me use my vacation days. I was never the bravest guy, and I admit I get jumpy even when a branch scrapes my windshield at night, but I'd always loved the freedom of the open road. So when I left that job, I thought I'd drive around the southeast to clear my head and maybe discover something better. My rig was a 1988 model with peeling paint, but it had a bed, a tiny kitchen, and enough space for my fishing gear. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot by the river, enjoy a few lazy days, and not worry about a soul. That first afternoon in Delana, I steered down a winding road that cut through thick pines and rolling hills. The sky looked a bit cloudy, but I couldn't resist the idea of stopping by the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'd never been much of a hiker, but I had a little collapsible chair and my fishing rod, so I figured I'd cast a line somewhere scenic. As I pulled onto a narrow dirt path, I passed a small white sign, half rusted, that indicated there was a campsite about half a mile deeper in. The site itself was nearly empty. I saw one other RV parked under a big oak and an old sedan missing its hubcaps. I hopped out of my vehicle, stretched, and hollered a friendly hello at the older gentleman leaning against his camper. He nodded back, but didn't say much. I sensed he preferred his own company, so I decided not to bother him. Then I noticed a young couple by the sedan looking like they were deciding whether to set up a tent or keep driving. It was quiet, and that suited me fine. I spent the evening fiddling with dinner, canned chili, heated in a little pot, and watched the sun go down beyond the hills. Everything felt calm until I heard this clatter of metal behind the trees. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a shovel dropping onto rocks, sharp and deliberate. I leaned out my RV door, peered through the gathering dusk, but saw only the silhouettes of tall pines. I figured maybe someone was setting up a fire pit. Next morning, I wandered off to a nearby trail with my fishing pole strapped over my shoulder. The day was cool, and the forest floor was damp from the night's drizzle. My boots sank an inch into the mud, but I kept going until I found a decent creek. A sign read, "No fishing without permit." So I decided not to push my luck. I ended up just sitting on a mossy log, letting the quiet seep in. At one point I heard voices upstream, two men talking in low, fast tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I caught the name Derek repeated maybe 3 or 4 times. Then one voice snapped, "Keep your mouth shut," before they fell silent. Something about the tension in that sentence made me pack up and head back to the RV. I'm not the type who rushes into trouble. I prefer to let folks handle their own business, so I tried not to dwell on it. But when I got back to my campsite, I noticed that old gentleman's RV was gone. The sedan was still there, but the couple was missing too. I assumed they went hiking, so I just shrugged and opened a bag of peanuts for a quick snack. Late afternoon, I decided to drive further down the forest road, looking for a better place to spend the night. As I navigated the ruts and bumps, I glimpsed something bright red through a gap in the trees. A piece of clothing, maybe. It looked like it had been tossed into the brush. I braked and hopped out to investigate. It was a t-shirt torn along the front and stained with a brownish blotch. I remember feeling a tight knot in my stomach. I forced myself to pick it up and saw the pattern of a popular band's logo. Definitely blood, dried, but fresh enough to give me a jolt of dread. I scanned the area and spotted footprints leading deeper into the woods. I followed them for a minute, but started to lose the trail when the ground turned rocky. That's when I smelled something foul. At first, I told myself it was just a dead deer or some rancid trash, but the stench was too strong, like old meat left out in the sun. My heart beat faster. I took a few cautious steps around a bush and found the older gentleman's body. He lay twisted on his side, eyes open, throat cut. I froze. My arms went numb and I nearly dropped the t-shirt. I backed away, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't see anyone else, so I sprinted back to the RV. It felt like my mind was on fire trying to process what I just witnessed. I fumbled for my phone, saw there was no signal, and realized how isolated I truly was. Part of me wanted to drive away as fast as possible, but that man's face was stuck in my head, and I also remembered the young couple. I'd never forgive myself if I left them in danger. I decided to head toward the main road, find a place with reception, and call the police. But just as I started the engine, I heard a truck roar behind me. A battered pickup barreled around the corner, blocking the path. A tall man with a shaved head and a scowl jumped out. He wore a dark green jacket with a strange patch on the sleeve, some kind of homemade emblem. I saw another figure in the passenger seat, but I couldn't make out his face through the tinted glass. The tall man stomped to my window, yanked the door handle, and stared at me. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken with a scar across his left cheek. He rapped on the window, demanding I step out. My heart pounded so loud, I thought he could hear it, but I forced a smile and cracked the window just enough to talk. "Get out!" he barked. His voice was icy. I gripped the steering wheel. "What's going on?" He looked at me like he wanted to rip the door off. "You seen anything you shouldn't?" I thought of that poor man's body. My eyes flicked to the spot where I knew it was hidden behind the bushes. The tall man caught that glance and raised his eyebrows. A mocking grin spread on his face. I pushed the gas pedal, hoping to jerk around him, but he shoved a metal bar straight through my half-open window. It smashed against the steering column and glass sprayed across my seat. Panicking, I threw the door open as hard as I could. It hit him in the shoulder and he stumbled back. I dove out, rolled on the ground, and ended up inches from his heavy boots. He swung that bar at my head, but I ducked and crawled under the RV, scraping my elbows on rocks. The passenger door of the pickup opened and I heard quick footsteps. Another man with thick stubble and a baseball cap kicked at my legs. I scrambled out the other side, fumbled into the driver's seat, and tried to slam the door shut. The tall man blocked it with his foot. I jammed the keys in the ignition, twisted them so hard I thought they might snap, and heard the engine catch. In the side mirror, I saw the stubbled man run behind me, rummaging in the bed of their truck. I knew I had only seconds. With the door half open, I slammed on the gas. The tall man jumped aside, cursing me. The RV screeched onto the main path, bouncing over potholes, swerving as I wrestled the wheel. My breath felt ragged, but I kept going. I heard a bang behind me, maybe a gunshot. I wasn't sure. My rear window shattered. I stomped the pedal, feeling the RV shudder with the strain. I skidded onto the paved road, then floored it, tears streaming down my face. The forest whipped by in a blur. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? Did they kill that old man over something trivial? Where was the couple? Were they alive? A few miles later, I found a small convenience store. I lurched into the parking lot, jumped out, and ran inside. The clerk saw my battered face and probably thought I was out of my mind, but he let me use the phone. The local sheriff's office said they'd send a deputy right away. I paced near the coffee machine, eyes darting at every car that passed, certain the tall man and his friend would find me. The deputies arrived in minutes. They took my statement and told me to stay put. I asked them about the young couple, whether they'd heard anything. They just told me to stay calm. Eventually, they found the older gentleman's RV near the body, and they confirmed he'd been murdered. I never saw that couple again, and I don't know if they got away or if something worse happened. The sheriff thanked me for my information, but also warned me that the men were still at large. I ended up following the patrol car back into Delana, where I spent the night in a cheap motel with a broken lock on the window. I barely slept, replaying every moment in my head. I wondered if I should have tried to help that older gentleman sooner, or if the couple had met the same end. I left Georgia the next morning. Even now, I'm uneasy behind the wheel of my RV. I see a stranger scowling by a gas pump, and I feel a shiver of old fear remembering that tall man and the dead look in his eyes. But I'm still here to talk about it. That's all I've got left. My name is Felix Vane, and this happened to me back in 2005 in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. While I was passing through with my old RV, I'd never intended to spend more than a night there. I was on my way east from a cross-country drive, hoping to see some scenic routes and taste the local food. I'm a retired middle school PE teacher, and after saving up for a few decades, I bought an RV to travel the country. Folks say I'm easygoing. I joke around a lot, maybe because I spent years breaking up dodgeball fights and handing out ice packs to dramatic fifth graders. Let's just say not much rattles me. But that week in Mount Sterling left me with memories I'd rather erase. It all started innocently. I rolled into a modest campground near a wide field dotted with small houses. The caretaker was an older woman named Donna. She greeted me with a warm smile and warned me that the showers only had lukewarm water. I laughed and said I'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches and cold showers for days. She gave me a key to the bathroom and pointed out where to park. The site was flat, close to a row of scraggly trees that offered a bit of shade in the late afternoon. The first evening passed without much happening. I set up a small grill by the RV, cooked some burgers, and chatted with another traveler named Mike. Mike was a delivery driver from Ohio who claimed to be on a soul-searching road trip. He was lean with a shaved head and more tattoos than I could count. He showed me a swirling rose ink on his arm, said it was from his wild days, but he didn't go into detail. We shared a few jokes, swapped tips on hidden tourist gems, and turned in early. The next morning I grabbed a cheap breakfast from a local diner, fluffy biscuits, sausage gravy, and a cup of weak coffee. It was a small place where you could hear the bacon sizzling in the back. A couple of police officers sat at the counter chatting about the high school basketball team. Mount Sterling felt friendly, maybe too friendly, the kind of place where everyone looks at you, trying to figure out if you're new or just passing by. I liked it, though. The slower pace had a certain charm. After breakfast, I decided to explore. A local told me about a trail outside town near an old farm that had been abandoned for decades. Supposedly, the path led to a scenic overlook. So I packed some water, locked up my RV, and hit the road in my worn sneakers. I passed rolling fields full of grazing horses, which is typical in that region. The day was warm, but not stifling. Everything smelled of fresh grass and damp earth. Halfway down a winding back road, I saw footprints in the mud. They were big, maybe a man's boots. I wondered if there were a few folks out hunting. Then I noticed something else. An old barn with boarded-up windows. I'm nosy by nature, so I wandered closer. There were tire tracks near the barn's entrance, fresh, deep ruts as though a heavy vehicle had come through. My gut told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't help inching forward. Inside, the barn smelled of damp hay and something sharper like stale gasoline. Shafts of sunlight lit up swirling dust motes. Rusted tools hung on the walls, a bent pitchfork, a battered shovel. I took a few steps. My shoe kicked something that rolled across the dirt floor. It was a flashlight cracked on one side. The batteries half spilled. A muffled thump startled me and I froze. I strained to listen but heard only my own breathing. So I backed out and told myself it was none of my business. I tried to shrug it off and carried on toward the trail. About an hour later, while looking at a half-dried creek, I nearly stumbled over a crumpled jacket lying in the grass. The jacket was streaked with mud and something dark that I tried not to think about. It looked like dried blood. I nudged it with my foot and found the wallet inside. The ID belonged to a man named Jeff Parsons. The photo showed a bearded guy with glasses, mid-30s. I'd never seen him, and I had no idea why his jacket was in that spot. My stomach churned. Suddenly, that barn felt like more than a curiosity. I hiked back to town, found the local police station, and handed over the wallet. The officer at the desk frowned. He said Jeff Parsons had been missing for a couple of days. He asked where I found it, scribbled notes, and told me to wait. Another officer joined us, a tall, serious fellow named Sergeant Bennett. He started asking me questions. Why was I poking around near that barn? Who else was with me? Did I notice anything out of the ordinary? I told him about the tire tracks, the busted flashlight, and that weird smell. He nodded, looking more concerned by the second. They told me to keep my eyes open and let them know if I remembered anything else. That evening, back at the campground, Donna seemed on edge. She leaned close and whispered that a couple of strangers had been asking about a traveler with an RV. She didn't recognize them, but they seemed impatient. I thanked her and headed toward my spot. That's when I noticed a different RV parked at the far end of the lot. It was dark green with tinted windows. I hadn't seen it that morning. I busied myself cleaning up, tried to relax, but my nerves were shot. I called Mike over for dinner again. He arrived with a bag of potato chips and a weary expression. He'd seen the new RV too. Said he'd walked by earlier and glimpsed two men inside, both wearing old ball caps, both stocky with rough edges. Didn't look friendly. I tried cracking a joke about how we weren't exactly in a five-star resort, but Mike wasn't laughing. We settled in my RV after dinner, flipping through random TV channels for background noise. Around 10, Mike said he'd head to his own camper. He was tired. I locked my doors and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint thud against the side of my RV. It sounded like someone pressing a palm against the metal. My heart hammered in my chest. I held my breath, hoping it was just the wind. Another thud came louder. Then it stopped. Morning brought a sickening discovery. Mike's camper door was open. Inside, everything was tossed around. Clothes, maps, leftover pizza on the floor. No sign of Mike. I rushed to the caretaker's office. Donna was frantic. She said she'd heard shouting in the middle of the night, but was too scared to go outside. She thought it was just rowdy folks. I called the police. Sergeant Bennett and another officer showed up, took our statements, and started searching the grounds. It didn't take long to find a fresh set of footprints leading into the field. They found Mike behind a low hill hidden by tall grass. He wasn't alive. There was blood on his shirt, and he had bruises around his neck as though someone had tackled him. Donna wailed. I felt my eyes burn. Mike had been an easy person to like. There was no reason for any of this. The police spread out. They discovered footprints from at least 2 people. They matched the size of those I saw near the barn. The green RV was gone, but a flattened patch of grass showed where it had been. Bennett cursed under his breath, then turned to me. He believed whoever took Mike was connected to Jeff Parsons' disappearance too. Now they'd likely run. But as we looked around, we spotted a man striding past the far edge of the field. He wore a ball cap and carried what looked like a shotgun. Bennett signaled us to stay back. He and his partner sprinted after the stranger. I couldn't stand there. I followed, keeping low, trying not to make noise. The man broke into a run. He was wide-shouldered with a cruel set to his jaw. Another figure emerged from behind an abandoned tractor. That second person tried to swing at Bennett. Chaos broke out. Gunshots echoed, tearing through the stillness. I ducked behind a tree stump and heard shouting. An officer tackled the second man, pinning him to the ground. The first man fired at Bennett, grazing his shoulder. Then Sergeant Bennett fired back and the man collapsed. More shouting. A wave of tension froze me in place. It was over in seconds. The second suspect, pinned by the officer, yelled, "Curses!" He wore a dirty plaid shirt streaked with mud and sweat. He looked strong with scars on his hands, no remorse in his eyes. The police secured both men. The first one was badly hit, not likely to survive. An ambulance arrived. More officers cordoned off the area. They found evidence linking these men to the barn where Jeff Parsons' body would eventually be discovered. They had apparently been kidnapping travelers and robbing them, then discarding them like trash. Mike just got in their way. A few hours later, I stood by my RV, numb and exhausted. Donna hovered, offering me coffee and a shaky hug. She was trembling, face pale. The police took statements again. They collected everything as evidence, from tire tracks to bullet casings. I wanted to pack up and drive off, but they told me to warn in case they needed more details. I left Mount Sterling the next day, my mind full of regrets and images I still can't erase. I keep thinking about Mike's casual laugh the night before. That could have been me. Maybe it should have been. I still crack jokes when I'm nervous, but the sparkle is gone. I drove away, watching the morning light stretch across the horizon. I'm just thankful I survived. The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year. Hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on. Just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations, just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right, it was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise. At least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal. Breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again. Faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else, something worse. A whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible, but definitely there. Human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. And yet, the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up, and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone. Always watching. Always there. My hands started shaking, and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds. But there they were, in every shot. Suddenly, the whispering started again. It was louder this time. Closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. "You shouldn't be here." That's what it sounded like. A woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while, I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. I didn't mean to. Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time, I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry, she was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated, louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down, the whispering faded, and slowly, the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move. But she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it, small, barely visible in the fog, a stone hidden among the trees. A grave, long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things, I realized, weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. My name is Gideon Wraith, and this happened to me back in 2010 near the Painted Desert in Arizona when I decided to take my old RV on a trip because I needed to clear my mind after quitting my job at the auto parts store. I remember how the heat felt that afternoon, dry and sharp, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I'd been winding along narrow desert roads, the sky wide and bare, searching for a pull-off where I could park for the night. The Painted Desert spread out across the horizon in layered bands of rust, pink, and ochre. I'd read somewhere that ancient people found it spiritual, and I hoped that those silent rock formations would grant me a little peace of mind. Truth is, I'd just gone through a nasty breakup. My fiancée left me for some lead guitarist in a bar band, and I needed a fresh start. My buddy tried cheering me up by loaning me his father's ancient fishing poles, but I'm not much of an angler. Still, I loaded them in the RV next to a cooler of root beer and set off, telling myself there had to be something better out there than feeling sorry for myself. That first evening, I found a secluded spot on a gravel spur off the main road. The vantage point was incredible. I unrolled a folding chair, cracked a cold bottle of root beer, and stared at the desert. The horizon looked endless, and for a moment, my troubles felt small. After dinner, some slightly burnt hot dogs over the tiny propane stove, I stretched out on a blanket by the RV. The sky turned from bright blue to orange, then cooled into the darkest night I'd ever witnessed, sprinkled with countless stars. I breathed easier than I had in months. That sense of freedom in wide open land makes you feel like anything is possible. Early the next morning, I heard the rumble of another vehicle. It was a battered pickup truck creeping along until it stopped about 100 yards from my spot. A tall man with a red bandana around his neck hopped out. He had this wiry, lean build, and his eyes seemed half hidden beneath a frayed straw hat. He glanced my way, gave a nod, then clapped the side of the truck before disappearing down a narrow trail between some scrubby bushes. I didn't think much of it. The desert draws all sorts of folks. Photographers, hikers, weirdos seeking cosmic vibes, you name it. I figured he might be on some private mission to find the best vantage for sunrise. By noon, the sun blazed overhead and I felt restless. I decided to drive a little deeper into the backcountry, see if I could spot any wildlife or interesting rock formations. Something about the Painted Desert calls you forward like an old friend who can't wait to show you everything. I hopped in my RV and navigated the rough roads as best I could, trying not to blow a tire on jagged rocks. The heat shimmered, making the horizon quiver. I felt alone, yet not lonely. That's when I spotted a van parked half hidden behind a giant boulder. I slowed to get a closer look. It looked old and rusted, tinted windows cracked in places. I thought maybe the driver was in trouble. In this kind of desert, one breakdown can mean a nightmarish situation. I pulled to the side and approached on foot, hollering, "Hello? Everything okay over there?" My voice sounded too loud in the stillness. Nobody answered. The driver's door was ajar, and there was a dark streak on the dusty paint that made my stomach clench. I stepped closer, ears ringing. Inside, I saw a mess of blankets and tangled cords. A strong metallic smell lingered. That's when I caught sight of a shape slumped in the passenger seat. I forced myself to lean in. Part of me already knew what I'd find. There was a person in there, motionless. His face was pale, eyes half open. A red stain spread across his chest, dried into his shirt. I felt every nerve in my body go tense. My hands shook. I whispered a few words I'd rather not repeat, fumbling for my phone. No signal. The heat, the stench, and the shock made me dizzy. I realized I needed to find help. But out here, help wasn't exactly around the corner. I hurried back to my RV, locked the doors, and turned the key. My heart pounded so loud I could hardly think. I decided the nearest ranger station was probably my best bet. They sometimes keep an eye on these remote areas. As I swung the RV back onto the dusty track, something moved in my rearview mirror. That tall man with the red bandana stood behind a distant ridge watching. My blood felt like it had turned to ice, but I just drove. My mind raced. Should I confront him? Flag him down? But something about his stance made my instincts scream to get away. So I pressed the gas, unsure if I was acting brave or cowardly. The roads twisted through ravines of layered rock. My tires kicked up clouds of dust, and every so often I glanced back to see if the man was following. I saw nothing, just that desert glare in the swirling wind. After about 20 minutes of tense driving, I spotted a sign that said Painted Desert Trailhead, and I knew there might be a small parking lot or a map kiosk, maybe a phone. I pulled in, relieved to see another vehicle, a dusty SUV with a faded license plate. The relief lasted until I noticed the SUV's windows were smashed. My gut churned with dread. I inched closer, then saw an older couple inside, slumped over the front seats. Their bodies looked twisted like they'd struggled. I was too late. The entire scene felt unreal. I didn't know whether to vomit, cry, or scream. Before I could decide, I heard a noise behind me. The tall man was there, that bandana wet with sweat, hat casting a shadow over eyes that seemed to stare right through me. He had a rifle cradled against his hip. I froze. He didn't say a word, just raised the barrel an inch, gesturing for me to step back from the SUV. I stepped back slowly, hands raised to show I wasn't a threat. My voice was shaky as I asked him what he wanted. He just crooked his finger, telling me to move around toward the rear of the SUV. I obeyed. The desert sun felt scorching. I could hardly breathe. Then I glanced at him, and for a split second, I saw something in his expression. Something cold, methodical. He wasn't robbing me. This was different. Before he could bark another silent order, I made a decision. I turned and sprinted. He fired, the shot exploding in the stillness. I ducked behind a boulder, my heart hammered so hard I almost choked on my own breath. I had nothing to defend myself with except a small pocket knife in the RV. Another shot ricocheted off the rocks. He was determined. I had to get to my vehicle, but it stood in the open about 50 yards away. I peered around the rock, saw him inching closer, rifle up. My palms slick with sweat, I yanked a stone from the ground and tossed it far in the opposite direction. As he glanced toward the noise, I scrambled behind another rock, trying to zigzag closer to my RV. He fired again. A chunk of rock chipped away near my head. Dust stung my eyes. I coughed, felt tears welling up from pure adrenaline and fear. Inch by inch, I edged toward the RV. The man cursed under his breath. My legs cramped, but I kept moving until I reached the side of the vehicle. I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. Another bullet lodged in the metal. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and the engine coughed into life. A quick glance at the mirror showed him rushing forward, eyes locked on me. The rifle barrel was up again. As I floored the accelerator, the bullet shattered my side mirror. Glass rained onto the driver's seat. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white, and roared out of the lot, desert dust trailing behind me. My heart hammered so wildly, I felt like passing out. But I kept the pedal down, swallowing air in frantic gulps. The RV rattled and pitched, but it held together, and soon the lot was a blur of desert behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, praying for the first sign of civilization. Eventually, I reached a lonely gas station with battered pumps. I lurched to a stop and ran inside, words tumbling out of me so fast the cashier couldn't make sense of them. I forced myself to breathe, to calmly say people were dead, that a rifle-wielding man was behind it, that we needed the police. The cashier grabbed a phone and dialed 911. Minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. It felt unreal, but I clung to the relief. The sheriff's deputy arrived first, a calm, steady figure in a tan uniform. I spilled the details, leading him and a small team back toward the painted desert. They asked me to stay in the cruiser while they investigated. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to distant radios crackle. Eventually, they returned grim-faced. They found bodies. They found the abandoned pickup. The murderer was gone. I answered questions for hours. They took statements, tested my hands for gunshot residue, made sure my story matched the evidence. I told them everything. The slumped man in the van, the older couple in the SUV, the shots fired. They believed me, or at least they seemed to. By sundown, they let me go, telling me they'd be in touch if more info surfaced. I crawled back into the RV, heart still pounding. I managed to drive to a proper campground, parked among a few other travelers, and finally shut off the engine. I sat in silence. My legs felt weak, my mind still spinning with the images of what I'd seen. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange relief just to see other people around. The next morning, I headed straight out of Arizona, driving until my back ached. It was hard to reconcile the beauty of the desert with the horrors hidden out there. Sometimes I wonder what drives a person to become so vicious, but I guess that's a mystery only he can answer. I'm safe now, but I'll never shake that memory. It started as just a routine weekend trip, a solo camping getaway in the Smoky Mountains. My name's Edwin Garrison, and I make a living off designing remote hiking and camping routes for outdoor magazines. I figured I'd get a couple of days to myself, scope out a potential new trailhead, and maybe put the finishing touches on a route I'd been working on. Now, I'm not really the nervous type, but I've had my share of strange encounters. Nothing I hadn't shaken off with a little wit and a drink or two at the end of the day. But what happened this time? It was different. The Smokies in October are pure gold. The leaves are vibrant, crisp to the sound, and the mountains roll with that mist that hangs low in the early morning, making you feel like you're standing on a giant's shoulders. I was just past a small town called Norris, Tennessee, driving my beat-up RV up a narrow, winding road that had barely enough shoulder for another vehicle to pass. No cell service, but that was to be expected. It's one of the perks of working out in the boonies. Once I found a spot, I parked off a seldom-used pullout on the mountainside, far enough off the road to feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. I'd been up since dawn, so I set up camp, pulled out a chair, and cracked open a can of the cheapest beer they sold at the town's market. The evening was quiet, with nothing but the occasional sound of a bird or small critter darting through the brush. At some point around sunset, I realized I hadn't seen another soul all day. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little off. I mean, this was a popular park. Usually I'd see other campers, hear the distant hum of another engine, or even see a couple of cars passing. But this time, nothing, just a thick, empty silence. As night fell, I decided to go for a quick walk around the area. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down a narrow trail that disappeared into the dark, thick woods behind my RV. The air was colder than I'd expected, sharp enough that I pulled my jacket tight around me. There was this smell too, like something wet and decaying, not uncommon in the woods, but this smell was sharper, stronger, the kind that gets up your nose and sticks. It didn't take long for me to feel like I wasn't alone. The trees pressed in tightly on either side, casting strange, twisting shadows that seemed to dance and move in the beam of my flashlight. I thought I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I chalked it up to my own feet on the ground, treading on dead leaves and twigs, but the sound continued even when I stopped. It was faint shuffling, but distinct. I called out, "Hey, is someone there?" expecting maybe a camper who'd wandered off trail, but nothing answered me, and the silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the footsteps. I decided I'd had enough of my evening stroll and turned back toward the RV. When I got to the clearing, the smell was stronger. Something had been here, around my RV. The ground near the door was all torn up, as if something heavy had been pacing there. My stomach tightened, but I told myself maybe it was just a wild animal sniffing around. I'd seen black bears up close before, but this felt different. I climbed into the RV and locked the door. It was late, and I'd had enough weirdness for one day. But as I lay there trying to sleep, I kept hearing this noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe a branch tapping the window, but it was steady, rhythmic, almost like something clawing at the side of the RV, just a light scratching, barely noticeable. I sat up and listened, my eyes adjusting to the darkness inside. The scratching was moving slowly from the back of the RV around to the side, like someone or something was pacing, checking every inch of the vehicle. My heart started pounding, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight and a sturdy metal pole from my camping gear, I cautiously opened the door and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. The beam swept over the trees, the brush, and then something moved. A shadow too big and too fast to be a bear. I only caught a glimpse of it, but what I saw chilled me to the bone. It was on all fours, with a massive, hulking body that reminded me of a jaguar, but much larger. Its fur was matted, and the way it moved was wrong, unnatural, almost like it was pulling itself along by its front limbs while the back half dragged behind. And the smell, thick like copper and rot, hit me in the face as it circled back into the dark. I scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut and locking it again, my hands shaking. I felt stupid, like some kid afraid of a monster under his bed, but this thing was no bedtime story. I heard it again now, louder, scratching and sniffing at the door. It must have sensed me inside, and it seemed like it was testing the metal, scraping and pushing at the frame. Then suddenly, it stopped. The silence was unnerving. I kept the flashlight pointed at the door, waiting, feeling like a rabbit trapped in a cage. Minutes passed, and just as I thought it might be gone, the whole RV lurched, tilting to one side as if something had rammed it. The impact sent me sprawling, and I heard glass shattering as the windows cracked under the pressure. I'd had enough. I didn't care what kind of creature it was anymore. I was getting out of there. I threw open the driver's door, jumped into the seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but just as I started to pull forward, I heard a horrible screeching sound, metal grinding against metal. Looking in the side mirror, I saw it. A massive clawed hand, like a giant sloth's, but with longer, knife-like nails, tearing into the back of the RV. I floored it, swerving down the narrow road, barely able to keep control as the RV shook. The thing held on for a moment longer, then finally fell off with a sickening thud. I didn't stop until I was miles down the mountain, where the road widened and I was sure it was gone. I sat there, catching my breath in shock, feeling the sweat pouring down my face. When I finally dared to look at the back of the RV, I could see deep gouges, rips in the metal siding, and bits of what looked like fur tangled in the scratches. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before, not from a bear or a big cat, nothing that should be out here in the mountains. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, where I found an old ranger named Tom sitting at the desk. I told him everything, showed him the damage, and he listened, nodding quietly. When I finished, he didn't ask any questions. Instead, he looked at me with this knowing expression, like he'd heard it all before. "You were up near the northern ridge, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, not sure what he was getting at. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. "People go missing up there sometimes. We don't talk about it much, but, well, let's just say you're lucky. That thing, whatever it is, it's been around longer than any of us, and we don't know what it wants or why it keeps showing up. But you're not the first to see it, and you won't be the last." He didn't offer me an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. There was nothing more to say. I thanked him and left, still shaking, wondering if I'd ever find a place that felt safe again. What began as a serene evening in the solitude of the forest spiraled into a nightmare so grotesque it would haunt me until my final breath. My name is Dean Kessler, and what I experienced back in October of 1987 deep in the Olympic National Forest still chills me to my core. I had lived off the grid for years, seeking refuge from a world that had grown too loud, too chaotic. My cabin, an old hunting shack, pieced together with little more than scrap wood and relentless effort, sat perched on a bluff overlooking a maze of dense cedar and fir trees. No running water, no electricity, just me, a propane stove, and a flickering lantern. That evening, the sky bled a deep, bruised purple as I chopped firewood. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine, and a fine mist curled around my boots, clinging to the earth like a living thing. The only sound was the rhythmic thudding of my axe, its bite into the wood oddly comforting. But then something felt off. A silence descended that was too deep, too unnatural. The birds, which usually filled the trees with their constant chatter, were gone. No crickets, not even the rustle of the wind. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I dismissed it at first. Maybe a predator was nearby, a cougar or a black bear, But there was nothing unusual in this isolation. I stacked the last of the wood, shaking the unease from my mind, and went inside. But even as the fire crackled to life, that itch in the back of my brain wouldn't go away. Something was wrong. Then, I saw it. A column of smoke rising in the distance to the north. At first, I thought it was another hermit like me, maybe someone camping or hunting. But as I watched the smoke curl up into the air, my stomach clenched. It was too late in the season for casual campers, and the spot was far from any trail. My closest neighbor was miles away. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at me. The smoke was wrong, sharp, acrid, like something burning it shouldn't. I grabbed my flashlight and my 357 Magnum, not willing to risk walking into the woods unarmed. The trail north was narrow, overgrown, and I knew it well. The beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, picking out gnarled roots and slick moss underfoot. The smoke was faint now, but the smell lingered, sour and metallic, mixed with something worse, scorched hair, rotting meat. A cold dread crawled up my spine. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight revealed a campsite in utter disarray, like something had torn through it with inhuman fury. A collapsed tent, scattered clothes, and the carcass of what might have been a goat, or something larger. It was hacked apart, its bones gleaming in the flashlight's beam. My stomach lurched. "Hello?" My voice sounded weak, swallowed by the unnatural stillness of the forest. No answer. I moved closer to the tent, scanning the area, my senses on edge. Then I saw it. A body, slumped against a tree. The man's neck was twisted at a grotesque angle, and his chest had been torn open like a gutted animal. I froze, bile rising in my throat. That's when I heard it, the crunch of leaves behind me. I spun, flashlight whipping through the darkness, catching glimpses of something moving, something circling. The sound of heavy, labored breathing filled the air, and I saw it. It stepped into the clearing, a towering silhouette, easily 7 feet tall. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its skin was sickly pale, stretched tight over its emaciated frame. Patches of fur clung to its torso. Its hands, no, its claws were tipped with something dark and glistening. It had no face, not really, just a gaping maw of jagged teeth, some broken, others sharp as knives. I didn't wait. My 3.57 was already in my hand, and I fired twice. The first shot went wide. The second found its mark, hitting the creature square in the shoulder. It staggered back, emitting a sound that made my teeth rattle, a shriek so raw and grating it felt like my very bones were being scraped against metal. It lunged at me, faster than I could process, and I barely dodged in time, slamming into the trunk of a tree. The gun barked again, the bullet tearing into its leg. It stumbled, but didn't fall. Instead, it turned its head toward me, its mouth stretching open impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth like jagged daggers. I was moving before I knew it, sprinting back toward the trail, my boots slipping on the slick ground. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the brush, gaining ground. I fired blindly over my shoulder, the shots ricocheting off trees, the creature's snarls growing louder. Closer, and then I felt it, claws raking across my back, tearing through my jacket, my skin. Blood sprayed onto the ground, warm and slick. I tripped, fell face first into the mud. My flashlight tumbled away, its beam flickering before it rolled out of sight. And then it was on me. Its claws raked across my arm, hot pain shooting through my veins. I screamed, my blood mixing with the earth beneath me. Desperation fueled me. I swung my gun up, pressing the barrel under its jaw, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed, deafening. The creature reared back, screeching in agony. But it didn't fall. It staggered, clutching at its face as though it couldn't comprehend the pain. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hands trembling as I grabbed it just as the creature lunged again. This time, I swung the metal casing like a club, connecting with its chest. It howled in fury, staggering back, giving me just enough time to fire once more. The bullet tore through its chest, and this time, the creature crumpled, twitching, its life snuffed out in an instant. I didn't wait to see if it would rise again. I bolted, half limping, half running, until the faint outline of my cabin came into view. I locked the door behind me, shoving the table against it, and grabbed the first aid kit. My arm was shredded, blood pooling on the floor, but I barely felt it. I stayed awake, the gun clutched tightly in my hand, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, expecting the worst. but nothing came. When dawn broke, I ventured back to the clearing with a fresh clip in my revolver. The campsite was exactly as I had left it, shredded, blood-soaked. The remains of the creature still sprawled on the ground. Its body was still there, lifeless. When the sheriff arrived with his deputies, they didn't speak much. They took photos, bagged the remains, and told me to stay put while they looked into it. They never called it a bear or anything else for that matter, but the looks on their faces said more than words ever could. As they drove away, the creature's body covered under a tarp in the back of their truck. One of the deputies, a man older than the rest, muttered a single word to his partner: Wendigo. The hum of the RV's engine was the only sound that filled the silence as I navigated the winding, desolate roads of the Adara Mountains. My name is Adrian Lockhart, a marine biologist who sought solace away from the ocean to explore a forgotten corner of the world. It was 2019, and I was chasing inspiration for a book about the interconnectedness of all ecosystems, hoping to find something in these darkened forests that might ignite my creativity. I pulled into a secluded campsite by a placid lake, the tall pines casting long, ominous shadows over the water. Only a few other RVs were parked nearby, their windows darkened by the encroaching dusk. I stepped out, stretching my legs, and that's when I noticed him. A man in his 50s, with a face weathered by years of hardship, his handshake firm and cold. "Name's Walter," he said, his voice rough as if he'd been speaking in whispers for too long. "Looks like we're neighbors." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Beautiful place, isn't it?" "Sure is," he replied, his eyes scanning the woods with an unsettling wariness. "Been coming here every summer for years. Just watch out for the wildlife. These woods have secrets." I chuckled, trying to ease the tension in his tone. "Don't they all?" After setting up camp, I decided to take a hike before nightfall. The forest seemed alive with the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls, but there was something wrong. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to close in around me. Strange carvings appeared on several trees, symbols I couldn't decipher, almost like warnings, marking the very air with unease. On my way back, I stumbled across an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded as though by claws, its contents strewn about in a haphazard mess. Pots and pans were dented, a backpack torn open, its contents spilling out like the remnants of something long forgotten. A chill gripped me. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew. Back at my RV, I found Walter speaking with a young couple who had parked a few spots away. The woman, her face pale, spoke in hushed tones. "Did you see that storm last night?" she asked. I shook my head. "I just got here today." Walter glanced at me, his expression hardening. "Strangest thing," he said, voice low. "No forecast mentioned it. It came and went in a flash." As the conversation drifted into stories of hikers who had disappeared over the years, search parties finding nothing but tattered clothes, I tried to dismiss the unease settling in my chest. But there was something about Walter's grim tone that stuck with me. Night fell. The air grew thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sleep came slowly, and at some point past midnight, a scream shattered the silence. It was sharp, a soul-piercing cry that abruptly cut off, leaving nothing but the silence to stretch like a wound. I jerked awake, my heart hammering. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The other RVs were dark, their occupants seemingly undisturbed. I walked toward Walter's camper, knocking on the door. No answer. I knocked harder, but a rustling sound from the trees caught my attention. I swung the flashlight toward the noise, but saw nothing. The shadows felt heavier, deeper. The forest felt wrong. I approached the young couple's RV. The door was ajar, swinging slightly. "Hello," I called. Silence. With a creeping dread, I pushed the door open further and gasped, nearly choking on the air thick with the stench of blood. The inside was chaos. Claw marks gouged the walls, blood smeared across the floor, pooling around furniture overturned in a violent frenzy. No sign of the couple. My heart raced as I backed out, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Then, movement. A hulking figure darted between the trees, its limbs too long, its speed too unnatural. I turned and ran back to my RV, fumbling to lock the door behind me. I tried to reach for my satellite phone, but realized I'd left it in the truck. Cursing under my breath, I peered out the window. The shadows outside shifted. Then the sound, guttural, deep, vibrating through the metal frame of the RV. A snarl. It was close. I grabbed the flare gun from my emergency kit. The creature circled my RV, its massive footsteps sending vibrations through the ground. For a moment, it stepped into the moonlight. The sight froze me in place. It was massive, like a grizzly, but upright, walking on powerful hind legs. Its body was covered in matted fur, its claws extending from paws the size of dinner plates. I aimed the flare gun, my hands trembling, sweat beading on my forehead. The creature slammed into the side of the RV, rocking it violently. Cabinets flew open, dishes clattered to the floor. I fired. The flare shot through the window, striking the beast square in the chest. It roared, stumbling back as flames licked at its fur. I seized the moment and sprinted to the driver's seat, starting the engine. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the dirt before finding traction. In the rearview mirror, I saw it, thrashing, trying to extinguish the flames. Then from the trees, more figures emerged. They were hunting in packs, huge deformed things that moved with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I barely had time to react before another one leaped onto the roof of the RV. The weight of it dented the ceiling. Walter, now beside me, grabbed a frying pan from the kitchenette. "Keep driving," he shouted as the creature's claws tore into the metal, reaching inside. Walter swung the pan with all his strength, smashing its arm. It howled in pain, retracting. "There!" Walter pointed ahead. A dimly lit lodge sat in the distance. I slammed on the brakes. "Get in!" I shouted. Walter climbed aboard, breathless. "They're everywhere!" he gasped. We sped toward the lodge, the creatures in relentless pursuit. The RV groaned with each turn, its heavy frame straining to keep up with the speed. Just when I thought we might outrun them, one of the monsters leapt onto the hood, its claws ripping through the metal. With a final, desperate lunge, I skidded into the lodge's gravel lot, throwing the RV into park. We bolted from the vehicle, racing inside, slamming the doors shut and barricading them behind us. The lodge was deserted. The interior was in ruins, chairs upturned, tables broken as though a storm had passed through. I grabbed Walter. "Help me find something to defend ourselves." We scavenged the area, finding a shotgun and a box of shells behind the counter. As we loaded the weapon, the creatures surrounded the lodge, their silhouettes visible through the windows. "They're like wolves," Walter muttered, loading the shotgun, "but smarter." The pounding began. The walls shuddered under their assault. One of them crashed through a window, and I fired the flare gun again, hitting it in the face. It recoiled, knocking over several others in the process. Walter opened fire, each blast ringing out in the quiet night. But then, a larger beast broke through the main door, knocking us both off our feet. It towered over the others, its hide scarred, its eyes glowing with malice. Walter fired, but the creature swiped at him, sending him flying into a table. In a frenzy, I grabbed a nearby gas lantern, smashing it across the beast's face. Flames erupted. It howled, thrashing wildly, setting the entire lodge ablaze. "We need to get out," I shouted, pulling Walter to his feet. We stumbled outside, the fire consuming the building behind us. The creatures, deterred by the flames, retreated into the forest. We were alive. But the horrors of that night had only begun. Minutes later, the sirens wailed in the distance. Park rangers and firefighters arrived, their faces a mix of disbelief and confusion at the scene before them. The charred bodies of unidentifiable creatures littered the ground, the lodge reduced to a smoldering ruin. Walter and I gave our statements to the authorities, their radios buzzing with frantic chatter. "Never seen anything like this," one ranger muttered, his eyes wide with fear. As we were escorted back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods, those cursed, ancient woods, were still watching, still waiting. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the horrors of the Adara Mountains weren't finished with us yet. My name is Caleb Renfield, and this happened to me on June 18th, 1986, in a part of the Shawn National Forest that doesn't see many folks. Back then, I was 32, stationed at the Granite Basin Trailhead, responsible for the far-flung campsites scattered over a stretch of rough wilderness, where every tree seemed to lean a little close, and every shadow hung a bit too thick. I'd been doing this for almost a decade, so I was used to The quiet, the stillness that came after dark, and the strange sounds that drifted out of the woods. Knocks could be unnerving, but I'd learned to brush it off. This time, though, something was off from the start. My girlfriend, Adele, used to joke that I'd end up being swallowed by the forest one day, like one of those unsolved mystery cases. I'd laugh, but her words stuck with me, especially since she'd recently moved to Boise, and the long-distance strain was wearing us thin. I thought about calling her that morning, but the ranger's cabin was too far from any phone lines, and the radio barely picked up a signal on good days. I settled for a quick patrol, figuring I'd get through my rounds and then maybe hike out to the next station the following day to check in with her. It started as a normal day, checking fire rings, logging wildlife sightings, cleaning up after campers who had no business out there in the first place. By mid-afternoon, though, a prickling unease began to set in. I spotted a peculiar track near one of the campsites. It wasn't like any animal print I'd seen in those woods. The shape looked human at first glance, but the toes were far too long, each ending in what looked like claws that dug deep into the soil. I crouched down, running my fingers along the print's edge, feeling a damp chill. The air seemed to hold a strange, musky scent, something earthy and rotten that lingered in the stillness. I radioed the main station, hoping for some advice, but the static crackled back, useless. I knew better than to let strange tracks bother me, so I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a bear track distorted by the rain the previous night. That's what I kept telling myself as I went on with my patrol. But that gnawing feeling of being watched never left. As dusk settled, the forest fell silent, more silent than usual. No rustling leaves, no calls of distant owls, just thick, oppressive quiet. I decided to head back toward the cabin earlier than usual. The trail was winding, and the canopy above blocked out most of the moonlight, casting long shadows across the path. When I reached the cabin, I found the door ajar, though I distinctly remembered locking it. I hesitated on the threshold, my flashlight casting a dim beam over the wooden floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but that musky, decayed odor was stronger here. I shut the door, bolted it tight, and tried to shake off the unease with a cup of instant coffee. As I sat by the window, watching the trees sway against the dark, I caught a flicker of movement, a shadow shifting between the trunks, gliding unnaturally. My heart thumped in my chest as I leaned closer to the window, my eyes straining to catch another glimpse. The shadow moved again, closer this time, and I could make out a gaunt, twisted figure lurking just beyond the tree line. It wasn't human, but it walked upright, its limbs too long and crooked, its shoulders hunched in an unnatural arch. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was staring right at me. I grabbed my rifle, an old Winchester I kept for emergencies, and positioned myself near the door. For a while, I waited, but the shadow didn't move closer. I debated whether to step outside and confront it or stay hidden, hoping it would leave. In the end, curiosity and stubbornness won out, and I unbolted the door, easing it open. The air outside was colder than it should have been, almost icy. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight, heart pounding, every breath fogging in the chill. The shadow was gone. I held my breath, listening for any sound, any rustling in the leaves, but there was only silence. Then, just as I began to lower the flashlight, a shrill, piercing howl ripped through the night, a sound that was neither animal nor human. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, bolting it tight. I locked every window, drawing the shades, even though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. My hands were shaking, the rifle slipping in my grip as I paced around the cabin, trying to think rationally, trying to convince myself that it was just some animal I didn't recognize. Hours passed. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the door, listening for the slightest sound. I might have dozed off at some point, though it was the kind of shallow, restless sleep that left me feeling more exhausted. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of scratching. Slow, deliberate scratches against the cabin wall. I held my breath, gripping the rifle as I moved toward the door, trying to pinpoint the sound. It circled the cabin, moving from wall to wall, slow and methodical, as though the thing was testing the boundaries. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence returned, thick and stifling. I waited, barely daring to breathe, hoping that whatever it was had decided to leave. But then the doorknob rattled just once, as if it were testing the lock. My pulse raced, adrenaline flooding my system. I raised the rifle, aiming it at the door, my finger trembling on the trigger. After a moment, the rattling stopped and the silence resumed. I dared to exhale, hoping that was the end of it. But then a voice, soft and mocking, whispered through the thin wood of the cabin door, "Caleb." My heart nearly stopped. It knew my name. I hadn't told a soul about this assignment except Adele, and she'd never even been here. Panic surged through me, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your mind go blank. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I stayed frozen, every muscle tensed, listening to that voice murmur my name over and over in a sing-song tone. The voice shifted, growing harsher, angrier. It started to scrape against the door, the sounds growing louder, more frantic. I could hear the wood splintering, small cracks forming as the thing outside clawed at the barrier. In a desperate move, I aimed the rifle at the door, ready to fire the second it broke through. My mind was racing, and I knew that even if I got a shot off, I might only make it angrier. But I didn't have a choice. The scratching grew louder, more intense, and I braced myself, waiting for it to finally break through. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was almost deafening. My heart hammered in my chest as I strained to hear any sound, any hint that it was still there. Minutes passed, then an hour. The sky began to lighten, a faint dawn creeping over the horizon. I waited until the sun was fully up, my hands still clenched around the rifle before I dared to open the door. The ground outside was disturbed, deep claw marks raked across the soil, leading off into the trees. Whatever it was had left, at least for now. I didn't wait to find out if it would return. I packed my gear and hiked the 10 miles to the next station, not looking back once. When I finally reached the ranger station and told them what happened, they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, to the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. My name is Byron Melrose, and this happened to me in 2006 at the Redwood National and State Parks in Northern California. I had been RV camping for the better part of a decade and thought I had seen it all. Grizzly bears rooting through my trash, raccoons breaking into my cooler, even a few strange folks who set off my alarm bells. But none of that prepared me for this. It started when I pulled my RV into the Gold Bluffs Beach campground. I had a spot overlooking the Pacific, the air thick with salt and the scent of redwoods. I had come to escape the grind for a week. My ex-wife used to say I worked too much and didn't know how to relax. Well, here I was, trying to prove her wrong with a cooler full of beers and a dog-eared mystery novel. The place was quieter than I expected for a summer weekend. Only 2 other RVs were parked, and both looked abandoned. One had its door ajar, flapping gently in the breeze. I shrugged it off. Not everyone locks up tight when they're off exploring. That evening, I built a fire and cracked open a beer. The beach was deserted, save for the occasional gull. The setting sun painted the cliffs gold and red. It was perfect, until I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting a fellow camper or maybe a park ranger. Instead, a man stood there, tall and wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of driftwood. His clothes were filthy, layers of jackets and pants despite the warm weather, and he carried a rusted machete strapped to his belt. "Nice fire," he said, his voice raspy. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound casual. "You camping here?" He didn't answer, just smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. Then he walked off toward the other RVs without another word. I watched until he disappeared into the trees. I couldn't shake the unease he left behind. It wasn't just his appearance. I'd seen plenty of drifters before. It was something in his eyes, like he was sizing me up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I kept my hunting knife close that night. The next morning, I found the door to one of the other RVs wide open. I called out, but no one answered. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. It was trashed. Clothes and supplies scattered everywhere. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the counter, the bread molding. Whoever owned the RV had left in a hurry. As I backed out, something caught my eye in the sand beneath the RV. It was a shoe, partially buried. I kicked at it thinking it was trash, but it didn't move. I crouched down and tugged it free, only to find a severed foot still inside. I'd sobbed. I stumbled back, nearly losing my breakfast. My first thought was to call the park rangers, but my phone had no signal out here. The nearest ranger station was a good 20-minute drive, and my gut told me not to leave my RV unattended. I grabbed my knife and went back to my site, locking myself in. Hours passed. I sat by the window, staring out at the empty beach and the line of trees beyond. Every sound set me on edge. Then, as dusk fell, I saw him again. The man with the machete. He was standing on the bluff, staring straight at my RV. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then he turned and vanished into the trees. I'd had enough. I decided to pack up and leave, even if it meant driving through the night. As I was loading up, I heard something scrape against the side of my RV. I froze, gripping my knife. Slowly, I peered around the corner. The man was there, crouched low, dragging the blade of his machete along the aluminum. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, grinning. I didn't answer. I darted back inside and locked the door. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. It was as if the battery was dead. I tried again, pumping the gas, but nothing happened. A loud bang echoed through the RV. He was pounding on the door, shouting now, "Come on out, let's talk!" I grabbed the only weapon I had, a flare gun from the emergency kit. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I pointed it at the door and yelled, "Go away or I'll shoot." The pounding stopped. The silence was worse. I crouched by the door, holding my breath. Minutes passed, then an hour. I dared to peek out the window, but he was gone. I stayed awake all night, jumping at every creak and rustle. When dawn broke, I ventured outside, knife in hand. The man was nowhere to be seen, but his handiwork was evident. My tires had been slashed and the battery cables were cut. I was stranded. I decided to walk to the ranger station. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. I packed a backpack with water, snacks, and the flare gun, then started down the dirt road. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual birdsong absent. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. About halfway there, I spotted something in the trees, a makeshift shelter built from branches and tarps. I crept closer, heart pounding. Inside, I found a stash of stolen goods, camping gear, wallets, and even a few IDs. One of them belonged to a young couple I'd seen on a missing persons flyer at the park entrance. Then I saw the machete propped against the shelter wall. It was clean, gleaming, almost as if freshly sharpened. My stomach turned as I noticed the dark stains on a nearby tarp. I backed away slowly, then broke into a run. The ranger station was empty when I arrived, a note on the door saying the staff were out on patrol. Desperation set in. I tried the radio inside but got only static. I found a first aid kit and a hunting rifle locked in a cabinet. Smashing the glass, I took the rifle and as much ammo as I could carry. On my way back to the RV, I heard him before I saw him. The crunch of boots on gravel. I ducked behind a tree, clutching the rifle. He emerged from the woods, dragging something behind him. It was a body wrapped in a bloody tarp. I raised the rifle, aiming for his chest. "Drop it," I shouted. He froze, then turned to face me. His grin was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You're not going to shoot me," he said. "Try me," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged, faster than I expected. I pulled the trigger, the shot echoing through the forest. He stumbled back, clutching his shoulder, but he didn't go down. "You're going to regret that," he growled, dropping the tarp and retreating into the trees. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I ran the rest of the way to my RV, locking myself inside. Hours passed before I dared to peek out. The tarp he'd been dragging was gone, but a trail of blood led into the woods. By nightfall, I heard sirens in the distance. The rangers had found my RV and were calling out my name. I stumbled out, exhausted, and explained everything. They searched the area and found the shelter, along with more bodies buried nearby. The man, however, was never caught. His real name was revealed days later. Lewis Hadley, a drifter with a history of violence. He'd been linked to several missing persons cases across the West Coast. The rangers told me they'd increase patrols, but it was cold comfort. I never went back to the Redwoods. The memories were enough. But I kept the flare gun, just in case. My name is Carter Reynolds. It was 2016, and I was parked in the dense and remote woods of the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. I'd been RV camping for years. Something about the solitude always appealed to me. Maybe it was the quiet, or the way you could cook breakfast while standing barefoot in nothing but your boxers, staring at a mountain range. That morning, I had one of those moments. The air was crisp, my coffee was strong, and I was utterly unaware that by nightfall I'd be running for my life. I had parked my RV near Pettit Lake, a beautiful spot surrounded by towering pines and jagged peaks. The whole area felt like something out of a postcard, and the only sounds were the occasional splash of fish in the lake and the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. I was alone, but I liked it that way. People came to places like this to unplug, but for me, there wasn't much to plug back into. My job had been downsized 6 months ago, and I'd taken what little severance I received and decided to hit the road. No boss, no deadlines, just me and the open wilderness. Around midday, I decided to hike a bit. Nothing too ambitious, just a casual walk to clear my head. The trail was unmarked, winding deeper into the forest. I didn't carry a gun, something I'd been chastised for by countless friends. I always figured I'd never need one. If anything went wrong, my trusty hatchet, bear spray, and quick feet would be enough. Spoiler alert, they weren't. About a mile in, I noticed something strange, a series of deep grooves in the bark of a tree about 6 feet high, as though someone had taken a blade to it in a fit of rage. But it wasn't just one tree. The markings appeared on others along the trail, spaced at irregular intervals. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I chalked it up to some forestry project or weird animal behavior. Still, I turned back, deciding that maybe today wasn't the day to explore unfamiliar paths. I spent the afternoon grilling a burger outside the RV and reading an old paperback. The sky was cloudless and the air smelled like pine needles and charcoal. It was the kind of peace that made you forget the outside world even existed. Then, as dusk settled in, I heard it. A scream. Not an animal, but human. Shrill and panicked, echoing through the forest. It lasted only a few seconds, but was unmistakable. I froze, heart hammering, listening for anything else. The forest fell silent. I told myself it could have been anything, maybe someone's bad idea of a prank or even just a weird bird call. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight and hatchet, locked the RV, and decided to head back toward the main road. Maybe it was paranoia, but the last thing I wanted was to be caught unprepared if something was out there. I hadn't made it more than 200 yards when I saw it. A flicker of movement between the trees. My beam caught a figure, tall and broad, wearing some sort of tattered jacket. He was dragging something, a heavy, awkward shape that thudded against the ground with every step. My breath caught as the beam illuminated what he was dragging. It was a body. For a split second, I considered calling out, asking if he needed help. Then logic kicked in. There was no reason for anyone to be hauling a body like that through the forest. I crouched low, killing the flashlight and holding my breath. The figure stopped. He turned, scanning the woods with a jerky, almost mechanical movement. His face was partially obscured by a wild mess of hair and a scruffy beard, but his posture was rigid, alert. I've never felt fear like that. It was primal, like my body knew I had to stay absolutely still or I wouldn't live to see morning. After what felt like an eternity, he resumed walking, dragging the body into the darkness. As soon as he was out of sight, I bolted back to the RV, trying to stay quiet, but not caring much if I made noise. I locked the door and turned off all the lights inside, crouching low beneath the windows. Minutes passed, then hours. I debated calling the cops, but reception was non-existent. My phone was more useful as a paperweight out here. My mind raced, thinking about that man, about the body. Who was he? What was he doing? The scream I'd heard earlier suddenly made horrifying sense. Someone else had been out here, and now they weren't. At some point, I must have dozed off. A sudden, sharp bang on the side of the RV snapped me awake. I froze, gripping the hatchet, trying to control my breathing. The bang came again, harder this time. Then a voice. It was gruff, low, and unsettlingly calm. He asked if anyone was inside, said he'd seen the RV on his way back from hunting and wanted to warn me about bears in the area. The lie was obvious. No hunter drags a body through the woods at night. My heart pounded as he knocked again. Harder, the RV shaking slightly with each impact. I stayed silent, praying he'd leave. Instead, he circled the RV, testing the door handle, tapping on the windows. When he reached the rear, I heard him fiddling with something. My stomach dropped as I realized he was trying to force the lock. Adrenaline took over. I started the engine, slamming the accelerator. The RV lurched forward and I heard a loud thud as he fell back. I didn't stop to see if he was okay. My only focus was getting the hell out of there. The narrow dirt road twisted through the forest and I drove like a madman, barely keeping the RV on the path. My headlights caught glimpses of trees, shadows darting between them, but I didn't look back. I hit the main road after what felt like hours and didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. I stumbled inside, pale and shaking, and told the clerk everything. He listened, eyes wide, and called the sheriff. When they arrived, they took my statement and promised to check the area. I stayed in a motel that night, unable to sleep. The image of that man and the body burned into my mind. The next day, the sheriff called. They'd found evidence, scratched trees, drag marks in the dirt, even a blood trail. But no body, no man. Just a campsite nearby, littered with crude tools, ropes, and a journal filled with ramblings about purifying the wilderness. His name, they later discovered, was Elroy Mathers, a drifter with a history of violence. He'd been linked to several disappearances in the region, but had always managed to slip through the cracks. The body he was dragging was never found. They speculated it was buried deep in the forest or disposed of in one of the lakes. What terrified me most was knowing he'd been out there for years, living off-grid, hunting not just animals but people. I left Idaho that day and haven't been back since. My RV is parked permanently now, not far from a suburban cul-de-sac, where the only danger is running out of beer at a barbecue. But every so often, I'll hear a sound in the night, a faint knock or rustle, and wonder if Elroy Mathers ever really stopped hunting. If you'd asked me about my life before last summer, I'd have said it was peaceful, maybe even a little boring. My name's Orrin Vick, and I live off the grid in a cabin deep in the Washington National Forest, Arkansas. It's not the kind of life most people want these days, but for me, it works. No neighbors, no noise, just me, a couple of dogs in the woods. I've been here for 5 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything this wilderness could throw at me. That changed on a warm August evening. It started around dusk while I was chopping wood by the tree line. The dogs, Hank and Rosie, were unusually quiet. Normally they'd bark at every squirrel or raccoon in sight, but that night they just sat there, staring into the forest. Rosie let out a low whine, her tail tucked between her legs. Hank, ever the brave one, was bristling, his hackles raised. I stepped closer, trying to see what had them so rattled. It wasn't like a bear or a cougar to come this close. I'd set traps and deterrents around the perimeter months ago. But something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the heavy weight of silence pressing down on me. "Come on, you two, let's head inside," I said, slinging the axe over my shoulder. That's when I saw the movement, a flicker of motion between the trees. It was fast, too fast for anything I'd ever seen out here. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Maybe a deer? But no, deer didn't move like that. Whatever it was stayed just out of sight, weaving through the dense foliage like a shadow. I backed toward the cabin, Hank and Rosie sticking close to my heels. I wasn't scared yet, but I was uneasy. Something wasn't right. Once inside, I bolted the door and checked the rifles hanging above the fireplace. I always kept them loaded, just in case. The dogs didn't settle, pacing around the cabin, their eyes darting to the windows. I turned on the lantern and sat at the table, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Then I heard it, a thud against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, like something testing the walls. I grabbed the rifle and moved toward the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Hank and Rosie growled low in their throats, their noses pressed to the floorboards. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. Another thud, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. I bolted to the window, peering into the dark. The lantern cast long shadows across the yard, but there was nothing there. I was about to chalk it up to the wind when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. They were big, bigger than any man's, and they led straight to the edge of the forest. My stomach twisted. Whatever was out there wasn't human. The thuds continued, circling the cabin faster now, like something was running laps around the place. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw open the door, rifle raised, and shouted into the dark, "Get out of here! I'm armed!" The woods answered with a sound that froze me in place. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was almost a laugh, low and mocking, like it knew something I didn't. I fired a warning shot into the air, and for a moment the noise stopped. I stood there, my breath clouding in the cool night air, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then it charged. It came out of the woods like a freight train, a hulking mass of muscle and sinew, its skin stretched tight over a frame that didn't make sense. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with limbs too long and a hunched back that made it look like it was always on the verge of collapse. I fired again, this time aiming for its chest. The bullet hit and the thing staggered, but it didn't go down. Instead, it let out a shriek, a high-pitched wail that made my ears ring, and lunged at me. I barely managed to slam the door shut in time. The force of its impact nearly knocked it off its hinges. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, backing away as the thing pounded against the wood. Hank and Rosie were barking like mad, their teeth bared as they stood between me and the door. I knew the cabin wouldn't hold for long. I made a split-second decision. Grabbing a box of shells, I shoved them into my pocket and ran for the back door. I whistled for the dogs, and we bolted into the night. The woods were a maze of shadows, every tree and bush looking like something that wanted to kill me. I could hear the thing behind us, crashing through the underbrush like a bulldozer. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. "Come on, Hank, Rosie," I shouted, pushing through a thicket of brambles. The dogs were ahead of me, their noses low to the ground as they led the way. I had no idea where we were going, but anywhere was better than the cabin. We came to a clearing and I turned to face the thing, raising the rifle. It stepped into the moonlight, and for the first time I got a good look at it. Its face was a nightmare, a twisted amalgamation of features that didn't belong together. It had a mouth full of jagged teeth, a nose like a snout, and patches of matted fur covering its body. I fired again, this time aiming for its head. The bullet hit, and the thing stumbled, blood spraying from the wound, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, its steps slower but just as determined. I was running out of bullets, and my hands were shaking too much to reload. The dogs were barking, circling the creature, trying to distract it. Then Hank lunged. "No!" I shouted, but it was too late. The thing swatted him away like he was nothing, sending him crashing into a tree. I felt a surge of rage and fired my last shot, hitting it square in the chest. It fell to its knees, its breath rattling like a broken engine. I grabbed a rock from the ground and ran at it, smashing the stone into its skull again and again until it finally stopped moving. The clearing was silent, save for my ragged breaths. Hank was alive, but hurt, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Rosie licked his face, whining softly. The creature lay sprawled on the ground, beanered, its body still, its blood soaking into the dirt, dark and viscous. I didn't stick around to examine it. I carried Hank back to the cabin, with Rosie trotting beside me. By the time I got there, the adrenaline was wearing off, and my whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. When I told the authorities what happened, they didn't question me. The creature's body was right where I'd left it, and they took it away without a word. Later, I found out what it was. A El Puss cat, a creature from old Cherokee legends. People said it was just a story, a warning for those who wandered too far into the woods. But I knew better. Some legends are real. My name is Darren Tuck, and it was 2004 in the middle of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. If you've never heard of it, let me paint you a picture. Endless woods, the kind of place where GPS signals fail and silence feels alive. I'm a guy who's always found peace in isolation, an irony not lost on someone who's been through 2 divorces before the age of 40. My RV had become both my sanctuary and my therapist. I figured a few days camping in the middle of nowhere would clear my head, maybe even give me a chance to write in that journal my second ex insisted I start. I pulled up to a spot I found on an old map. No official campsite, just a clearing barely visible from the unmarked dirt road. The forest smelled damp, earthy, alive in a way that's hard to describe but easy to miss when you're back in civilization. I parked, leveled the RV, and stepped out to stretch. The woods swallowed sound, even the birds seemed cautious. After dinner, I set up a chair outside with a bottle of whiskey and stared into the black void. That's when I noticed something odd. A faint glimmer in the distance, like a flashlight, but too erratic to belong to a hiker. I told myself it was probably a reflection, maybe an animal's eyes, and tried to ignore it. The light didn't go away, though. If anything, it grew closer, not rushing, just approaching. By the time I realized this wasn't some trick of the woods, it was too late to do anything but stand there holding my whiskey bottle like a weapon. I called out to see if anyone needed help, but no answer came, just the light and now the faint crunch of footsteps. What stepped into the dim glow of my RV's exterior light wasn't what I expected. A man, tall and wiry, his clothes ripped and stained with something dark. He carried a machete, the blade reflecting the light like a wicked grin. His face looked sunken, almost skeletal, with an oily beard clinging to his jawline. He stopped a few feet away and tilted his head as if sizing me up. I asked if he was lost, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. He didn't respond, just stared at me, his chest rising and falling in jagged breaths. Then he smiled, a grotesque twist of his lips that made my stomach churn, and said he was looking for someone. I didn't like the way he said it, like he already knew the answer. My grip on the whiskey bottle tightened as I told him there was no one here but me. His smile vanished, replaced by an expression so blank it felt like he'd removed a mask. Without a word, he turned and walked back into the darkness, the machete dragging against the dirt. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the RV's frame, every rustle of leaves, had me gripping the tire iron I'd stashed under my bed. By morning, I convinced myself I'd scared him off. Maybe he'd been a drifter, high on something, or just plain crazy. Either way, I decided to cut my trip short. Packing up took less than an hour, but when I stepped outside to secure the RV's side hatch, I saw something that made my heart pound. Boot prints in the soft earth, circling the RV. They were fresh, overlapping each other in a chaotic pattern. Whoever had made them had been pacing all night. I locked myself inside, started the engine, and floored it down the dirt road. The forest blurred past as I drove, every shadow and movement a potential threat. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. The attendant, a gruff man with a stained cap and a cigarette tucked behind his ear, watched me like I was about to rob the place. I told him about the man in the woods, how he'd been armed and acting strangely. He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he leaned over the counter and said people went missing out there all the time. Hikers, hunters, campers. Some were found, or pieces of them anyway, but most weren't. He said locals had a name for the area, Dead Man's Loop. I thought he was messing with me until he pointed to a corkboard by the entrance covered in missing person flyers. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was fear or anger or sheer stupidity, but I decided I wasn't going to let some deranged lunatic drive me away from the one thing that gave me peace. I'd spent my life running from problems, and I was sick of it. I filled up the RV, bought a hatchet from the hardware section, and drove back to the forest. This time, I parked in a different spot, deeper into the woods, near a stream. The idea was to stay out of sight, make it harder for anyone to find me. As night fell, I kept the lights off and stayed inside, listening. Hours passed and nothing happened. The woods were silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. I started to think I'd overreacted. Maybe the guy had moved on, found someone else to torment. But around midnight, the silence broke. A loud thud echoed from the back of the RV, followed by the sound of something scraping against metal. My blood turned cold as I grabbed the hatchet and crept toward the door. Peeking through the window, I saw him, the same man from before, crouched near the rear hatch, his machete carving deep grooves into the RV's frame. He was muttering to himself, words I couldn't make out, but that sounded frantic, almost desperate. I threw the door open and shouted, the hatchet raised above my head. He turned, startled, and for a moment we just stared at each other. Then he lunged, not at me, but toward the woods. He moved fast, disappearing into the darkness before I could react. I spent the rest of the night barricaded inside, every light on, the hatchet in one hand and my phone in the other. No signal, of course. By morning, I found scratches all along the RV's sides and a pile of animal bones near the door. Small ones, rabbits maybe, but the implication was clear. This wasn't random. He was playing with me, and I'd had enough. I packed up and drove straight to the nearest ranger station. The officer on duty listened to my story with a mix of skepticism and concern. He asked me to describe the man, then frowned. Said it sounded like someone they'd been looking for. A guy named Frank Laro, a former local who'd gone off the grid years ago after being linked to several murders. The ranger promised to send a patrol to the area and told me to stay in town until they'd cleared it. I didn't argue. I checked into a cheap motel and spent the day glued to the local news, waiting for any updates. By evening, there was nothing. No calls, no breaking news, just silence. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the forest, parking near the ranger station and walking the rest of the way to my original campsite. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension that makes your skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I saw them, 2 rangers lying face down in the dirt, their uniforms soaked in red. My stomach churned as I backed away, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind me. I turned, hatchet in hand, and there he was, Frank Laro, his machete dripping with blood. This time, he didn't smile. He lunged, and I swung the hatchet, caught his shoulder, but he didn't stop. We hit the ground, rolling through the dirt and leaves, the machete inches from my throat. Somehow I managed to twist free, kicking him hard enough to make him stumble. I didn't think, I just ran, crashing through the woods, my lungs burning with every breath. The sound of his pursuit was deafening, branches snapping and leaves rustling as he closed the distance. Then, suddenly, the ground disappeared beneath me. I tumbled down a steep incline, landing hard at the bottom. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't stop. I crawled, dragged myself toward the faint glow of headlights in the distance, my RV. I'd made it back. The door was locked, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I climbed inside and slammed it shut. I saw him at the edge of the clearing. He stood there, machete in hand, staring at the RV. Then slowly, he turned and disappeared into the woods. I drove straight to the police station, not stopping until I was safely inside. They took my statement, sent officers to the forest, and later confirmed what I'd seen. The bodies of 2 rangers, the scratches on my RV, and the animal bones. Frank Laro was never caught, but his name and his crimes became part of local legend. Weeks later, I learned more about him. A drifter with a history of violence, he'd been suspected of killing campers and hunters across several states. They found his campsite deep in the woods, littered with stolen gear and gruesome trophies. Frank Laro wasn't invincible. He was human, just a man, a very dangerous one. But he'd managed to elude capture for years, and for reasons I'll never understand, he'd chosen me as his next victim. The last I heard, the case was still open. The Allegheny National Forest remains as silent and eerie as ever, but I've learned to stick to campgrounds with other people. You never know who's out there watching. My name is Reuben Holloway, and it was 1997 when this all went down in the Great Smoky Mountains. I was on what was supposed to be a relaxing solo RV trip, a break from my usually chaotic life as a freelance photographer in Chicago. I needed the isolation, the silence of the wilderness, and the time away from an endless parade of deadlines and city noise. At least, that was the plan. I had driven my 1983 Winnebago deep into the park, far past the main camping areas. I liked my solitude, and the farther I got from other people, the better it felt. The spot I settled on was picturesque, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees with a stream running not too far off. I set up a simple camp, a few lawn chairs outside the RV and a small fire pit. It was shaping up to be a peaceful weekend. By mid-afternoon, I had my camera out, taking shots of the serene landscape. The sound of the rushing stream and birds overhead filled the air. Around then, I noticed something odd. A battered sedan rolled past on the dirt road, going much farther into the forest than seemed reasonable. I didn't think much of it at first, though the driver, a wiry man with a wild beard, gave me a long, unsettling look as he passed by. The passenger, a younger guy with a baseball cap pulled low, seemed to avoid looking my way altogether. I chalked it up to locals or other campers looking for a secluded spot, but there was something about the way that car moved slowly, deliberately, that left me uneasy. It wasn't until later that I would realize I should have trusted my gut. That evening, I was cooking a simple dinner over my campfire when I heard it, a faint but sharp cracking sound, like someone stepping on a large branch. I paused, spatula in hand, and strained to listen. It was too rhythmic to be an animal step. Pause, step, pause. Someone was moving just beyond the tree line. "Hey, who's out there?" I called, my voice steadier than I expected. No answer. The steps stopped after a long moment of silence. I figured it was a deer or maybe a bear, though neither of those would stop from me shouting. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the perimeter. Nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the woods at night. I went back to my fire and ate quickly, keeping the flashlight within arm's reach. The unease grew as night fell. Every so often, I thought I heard distant rustling or snapping branches. Maybe the isolation was getting to me, or maybe not. Around 10 p.m., I was inside the RV, flipping through a magazine with a can of beer, when the distinct hum of an engine reached my ears. Peeking out the small window, I saw headlights bouncing down the dirt road toward my campsite. My stomach sank. It was the sedan from earlier. I quickly locked the RV's door and shut off the lights inside. I didn't want them knowing I was awake. From the gap in the curtain, I watched as the car pulled into my clearing. They didn't park close, just at the edge of the tree line, facing my RV. The wiry, bearded man stepped out first, stretching like he was shaking off a long drive. The younger man followed, his baseball cap pulled low again. They lingered by the car, talking too low for me to hear. After a while, the older one lit a cigarette and seemed to glance my way. That's when I realized they weren't camping. They had no gear, no supplies, just themselves and whatever was in that sedan. I debated my options. Staying put seemed smart, but if they decided to approach, my RV's thin walls wouldn't do much good. Running into the woods didn't feel like a better idea either. Minutes ticked by and they just stood there. Then, the younger one popped the trunk and the older guy pulled something out. It looked like a machete. My pulse quickened. "Get it done," the bearded man said, his voice carrying just enough for me to hear. The younger man hesitated, then nodded. He took the machete and began walking toward my RV. I bolted to the small bathroom at the back, crouching as low as I could. My hands fumbled for my Swiss Army knife. A pitiful defense, but it was all I had. The sound of footsteps crunching gravel outside grew louder. Then came the tapping, 3 deliberate raps on the RV door. I held my breath. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hey, anyone in there?" he called. His voice was casual, almost friendly, but it had an edge that made my skin crawl. Silence. More silence. Then I heard him trying the handle. Locked. "Thank God. I know you're in there," he said, his voice lowering. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." My mind raced. The RV had no back door, no way out without exposing myself. The only thing separating us was a thin lock and a prayer. Suddenly, the sharp crack of breaking glass cut through the air. I peeked out from my hiding spot to see him reaching through the busted window of the RV door, fumbling for the lock. I had seconds. Grabbing my knife, I bolted toward him, aiming for shock rather than precision. The blade jabbed into his forearm, and he yelped, stumbling back. His machete clattered to the ground. Seizing the moment, I kicked the door open, sending him sprawling. The bearded man was already running toward us, yelling obscenities. I didn't wait. I darted into the woods, not caring about the noise I made. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard them shouting, crashing through the underbrush. They were following me. I veered off the trail, hoping the dense foliage would slow them down. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but stopping wasn't an option. Eventually, I came across a shallow ravine. Sliding down into it, I crouched behind a fallen log, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by angry muttering. "Idiot, let him stab you," the bearded man said. "He's probably bleeding out somewhere," the younger one retorted, though his voice wavered. They passed by, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness above me. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, until their voices faded into the distance. When I was sure they were gone, I crept back toward the RV. It was a risk, but I couldn't leave without my keys and supplies. The campsite was eerily quiet when I got back. The sedan was gone, but the RV door hung open, its interior ransacked. Blood drops on the ground confirmed I'd injured the younger man. I grabbed my keys, a flashlight, and my phone, which had no signal. Packing what little I could carry, I decided to leave the RV. Driving out in the dark felt too risky. I'd have to wait until daylight. I spent the night perched in a tree, clutching my knife and flashlight. Every sound set my nerves on edge. The hours crawled by, but morning eventually came. The first light revealed a chilling sight. Just beyond my RV, partially hidden in the bushes, was a shallow grave. Dirt had been hastily piled over what looked like a human arm. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. The sedan's trunk wasn't empty after all. I stumbled onto the road and started walking. Hours later, I flagged down a ranger's truck, explaining everything in a jumbled rush. I led them back to my campsite. They found the grave, and in it 2 bodies, a man and a woman, both missing for weeks. The authorities pieced together what they could, but the 2 men who attacked me, they were gone. A week later, I read about them in the paper. The older one, Randy Thurston, had a history of violent crime and was wanted for a string of murders in multiple states. The younger one, Eddie, was his nephew. Together, they'd been using the national parks to hide their victims. They're still out there somewhere, at least that's what the police said. But I like to think the wound I gave Eddie slowed them down. Maybe enough to keep someone else alive. The text now has corrected spelling and some punctuation adjustments for clarity. My name is Drew Kellerman, and back in 2018, I decided to spend a long weekend RV camping in the remote forests near Thunder Bay, Ontario. I'd been on the road for 3 years now, traveling around North America in an old RV that broke down just enough to remind me that my mechanical skills weren't as bad as I thought. People ask why I chose this life. I say it's cheaper than therapy and more scenic. After years of working in cubicles and dodging pointless meetings, solitude seemed like the best company. That weekend, the weather was perfect for camping. Crisp air with a slight hint of pine and damp earth. My spot was a clearing nestled near a narrow gravel road that nobody in their right mind would take unless they had something to hide or a death wish. I'd parked the RV, lit a campfire, and settled in with my favorite ritual, cheap beer and a book that made me feel smarter than I actually was. Just as the sky turned the kind of dark that erases the horizon, I heard it. A dull thud in the distance, then another. It sounded like something heavy hitting wood. I chalked it up to dead trees falling in the wind, but the air was still and the rhythm felt off, too deliberate. Moments later, my dog Red, a mutt with more bark than bite, growled low from his spot by the fire. He wasn't one to growl unless something deserved it. I turned off my lantern, letting the firelight cast shifting shadows, listening intently. I caught another noise, something moving, dragging almost, through the dense brush just beyond my line of sight. Probably a deer, I muttered to Red, who didn't seem convinced. His growl deepened, and he crouched low, ears pinned back. Grabbing a flashlight and the tire iron I kept near the RV door, I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the underbrush swayed like something big had pushed through it recently. Just as I was about to brush it off, I caught a glint of something metallic. It hung there in the darkness, reflecting the faint flicker of my flashlight. Red barked sharply, startling me enough to fumble the light for a second. When I studied it, whatever had glinted was gone. "All right, Red, you're scaring yourself," I said, more to calm myself than him. By midnight, the noises had stopped, and I convinced myself that paranoia and a few beers had blown things out of proportion. I locked the RV door, checked the windows, and settled in for the night. Red, however, refused to sleep. He kept pacing, occasionally staring at the door and growling softly. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something scraping against the side of the RV. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of noise that demands your attention, deliberate and unhurried. My stomach churned as adrenaline surged through me. Red's growl turned into frantic barking, his claws scraping against the RV floor as he ran from the door to the window and back. Gripping the tire iron, I peered out the small window near the kitchenette. Nothing. I moved to the front windshield and saw it. A man standing about 15 feet away, bathed in the faint moonlight. He was tall, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of driftwood. all sharp angles and deep creases. His clothes were filthy, his shirt dark with stains I didn't want to think about. In one hand, he held a rusted hatchet. The other hand dangled something that looked alarmingly like a human jawbone. My breath caught, and every rational thought screamed to stay hidden, but Red's barking gave away any advantage I had. The man turned his head slowly toward the RV, tilting it like he was trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Then, without warning, he took a step forward, dragging the hatchet along the gravel. I bolted for the driver's seat, yanked the keys from my pocket, and turned them in the ignition. Nothing, just a click. I tried again, praying to gods I didn't believe in. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The man was closer now, his footsteps crunching over the gravel. Red was losing his mind, barking and clawing at the door, as if he could scare off this nightmare. Realizing the RV wasn't going anywhere, I grabbed my flashlight and the tire iron, unlocked the back door, and slipped into the night. Red was close on my heels. We ran into the woods, the flashlight bouncing erratically with my steps. Behind us, I heard the RV door creak open. My heart sank. He was inside. We kept running until the RV was out of sight, and the only sounds were my labored breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. I crouched behind a fallen tree, holding Red close to keep him quiet. My mind raced, weighing my options. The gravel road was too far, and even if I reached it, what then? This was the middle of nowhere. A new sound pierced the silence. A whistle. It was cheerful, almost mocking, and it was getting closer. I killed the flashlight, holding my breath. The whistling stopped, replaced by the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. He was close. Too close. Red's body tensed, but he stayed quiet, as if sensing how critical it was. I tightened my grip on the tire iron, muscles coiled, ready to swing at anything that came into view. Then a voice cut through the darkness. It was gravelly and calm, with a hint of amusement. "You know, I've never been good at hide and seek, but I always win." My blood ran cold. I adjusted my grip on the tire iron, praying I wouldn't have to use it, but knowing I probably would. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought he'd left, but then I heard the faintest sound of breathing, steady and deliberate, just on the other side of the fallen tree. I swung the tire iron blindly, connecting with something solid. A grunt followed, then a string of curses. I bolted, flashlight forgotten, dragging Red by the collar. Branches clawed at my face and arms as I stumbled through the dark, but I didn't care. All I knew was I needed distance. Behind me, the whistling started again, though it sounded more ragged now, like he was struggling to keep up. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto the gravel road, lungs burning, legs shaking. I turned to face the direction we'd come from, tire iron raised, ready for the fight of my life. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet hum of the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I found an old abandoned service station about a mile down the road and holed up there until sunrise. When I finally returned to the RV, it was trashed. The seats were slashed, cabinets emptied, and the walls smeared with something, but what made my stomach churn was the message scratched into the table. "Next time I'll win." I reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably a drifter, they said, unlikely to come back. I didn't stick around to find out. Months later, out of morbid curiosity, I did some digging and found reports of missing campers in the area dating back years. Some bodies were found, others weren't. One name came up repeatedly in local lore: Silas Guy, a hermit with a penchant for violence, who disappeared decades ago after being accused of multiple murders. They said he'd fled into the woods, evading capture, and was presumed dead. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just some lunatic inspired by the stories. Either way, I haven't been back to Thunder Bay since.